A 52-year-old widow stands pregnant before an entire town demanding answers. The father? The most powerful man in 3 counties, a man who could destroy her with silence. But when hoofbeats thunder through the dust and Dalton Reeves dismounts to claim what's his, Red Hollow learns that some truths refuse to be buried. This is a story about courage that doesn't belong to youth, and love that doesn't bow to scandal. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first snow of the season fell on Red Hollow like a prophecy nobody wanted to read. It came early that year, dusting the weathered storefronts and wooden walkways with a white so pure it seemed to mock the town's grimier truths. Margaret Hale stood at her window, watching the flakes spiral downward, each one a tiny messenger carrying winter's promise of isolation. At 52, Margaret had learned to make herself small. Not physically, she stood a respectable 5'6", with shoulders that still carried their strength despite the years. But socially, emotionally, she had mastered the art of occupying minimal space. In a town like Red Hollow, that was how a widow survived. Her cottage sat at the eastern edge of town, close enough to hear the Saturday night revelry from the saloon, far enough to pretend she didn't. 2 rooms, a kitchen barely wide enough to turn around in, and a workshop where she spent most of her waking hours bent over needle and thread. The sign outside, painted by her late husband Thomas 7 years ago, still read, "Hale's Mending," in letters that were beginning to fade. Thomas. Even now, his absence occupied more space than his presence ever had. A good man, the town had said at his funeral. Quiet, dependable, the kind of husband who came home precisely at 6, ate whatever was put before him, and fell asleep by 9 with his boots still on. Margaret had mourned him genuinely, if not passionately. Their marriage had been a practical arrangement that had, over 23 years, developed into something resembling affection. She turned from the window and surveyed the 4 coats hanging on pegs along the far wall. 2 needed buttons replaced, 1 required a torn seam repaired, and the 4th, a heavy sheepskin belonging to Chet Morrison, needed a complete relining. She'd charge him $3 for it, and he'd complain it was too much, and she'd remind him that nobody else in Red Hollow could do the work as well, and he'd pay, resentful as always. That was the dance. The eternal, exhausting dance of being a woman alone in a town that believed women belonged to someone. Margaret lit the oil lamp on her work table as the afternoon light began to fail. Her fingers, still nimble despite the arthritis that had begun to whisper in her knuckles, selected a spool of brown thread that matched the sheepskin's interior. She was reaching for her needle case when the nausea hit. It came in a wave, sudden and overwhelming, forcing her to grip the edge of the table. The room tilted, her mouth flooded with saliva. She barely made it to the basin before her stomach emptied itself of the modest breakfast she'd eaten hours ago. This was the 3rd time this week. Margaret wiped her mouth with a cloth, hands trembling. She told herself it was spoiled meat from the butcher, or perhaps the water from her well had finally gone bad. Or maybe, and this thought crept in despite her attempts to push it away, maybe she was simply getting old, and this was what aging looked like when you did it alone, with nobody to notice your decline until you failed to appear at your own doorstep. But deep down, in a place she refused to examine too closely, Margaret knew better. She knew because her courses, which had become irregular over the past few years, had stopped entirely 3 months ago. She knew because her breasts had become tender, swollen. She knew because her body, which she had inhabited for 52 years, was telling her something that her mind absolutely refused to accept. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. And yet, the next morning, Margaret forced herself to attend Sunday service at Red Hollow Community Church. It was a test, really. If she could sit through Reverend Paulson's sermon without anyone noticing anything amiss, then perhaps she was imagining things. Perhaps this was all some elaborate trick of a body in decline, a final cruel joke before it released her into the invisibility of old age. The church was never full. Red Hollow's population had been shrinking for years as younger folks moved east toward opportunity, but today it seemed particularly sparse. Maybe 30 people scattered among pews that could hold twice that. Margaret took her usual spot in the back, nodding politely to Sarah Jensen, who sat 2 rows ahead with her 3 children arranged like stair-steps beside her. Reverend Paulson, a thin man with a voice that never quite matched his convictions, droned on about perseverance and faith. Margaret tried to focus, but her mind kept wandering to the impossible thing growing inside her. If it was real, if she wasn't losing her mind. Sister Margaret? She looked up to find Constance Fletcher standing beside her pew. Constance, the town's most devoted gossip, wore her Sunday best, a purple dress that had been fashionable perhaps a decade ago, and an expression of practiced concern that didn't reach her eyes. Yes, Constance? Are you feeling well? You look peaked. It was a trap disguised as caring. Margaret recognized it immediately. Any admission of illness would spread through Red Hollow faster than wildfire through dry grass. Just a bit tired, Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady. Been working late on Chet Morrison's coat. Constance's eyes narrowed slightly. You should take better care of yourself. A woman your age needs proper rest. A woman your age? The phrase hung in the air between them like an accusation. Margaret smiled tightly. Thank you for your concern. After the service, as people filed out into the bright autumn morning, Margaret felt the weight of their glances. Nothing overt, nothing she could point to and say, there, that's judgment. But it was there nonetheless, in the way conversations paused when she passed, in the careful distance others maintained. Or perhaps she was imagining it. Perhaps guilt was making her paranoid. She walked home quickly, head down, grateful when her cottage door finally closed behind her. The pregnancy, because that's what it was, no matter how much Margaret tried to deny it, made itself undeniable over the following weeks. Her dresses grew tight across the middle. Not much at first, just enough that she had to loosen her belt a notch, then another. She told herself it was middle-age spread, though she'd never struggled with weight before. She ate less, hoping to reverse whatever was happening, but her body refused to cooperate. By late October, she could no longer button her good Sunday dress. Margaret stood in her chemise before the small mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. Her stomach, which had always been relatively flat, now curved outward in a way that was unmistakable. She pressed her hands against it, feeling the firmness beneath. No, she whispered to the empty room. No, this can't be. But it was. She thought back to those days in February when the blizzard had stranded her at the Reeves Ranch. Those impossible, surreal days when the world had shrunk to firelight and conversation and the unexpected warmth of human connection. Dalton Reeves. His name alone carried weight in Red Hollow. The most powerful rancher in 3 counties, a man whose word could make or break livelihoods, who commanded respect through sheer force of presence. A widower himself, though his wife had died more than a decade ago, leaving him to raise their son alone. Margaret had known him by reputation long before that winter. Everyone did. But she'd never spoken to him directly until her wagon wheel had shattered on the old mining road, leaving her stranded miles from town with night falling and the temperature dropping toward deadly. She'd tried to walk back, foolish as that was. The cold had been relentless, turning her fingers numb, her thoughts sluggish. She remembered stumbling, remembered the snow that had seemed so beautiful becoming a white blindness, remembered thinking with an odd sense of calm that this was how it ended. Then hoofbeats. A voice cutting through the wind, strong hands lifting her. After that, everything had become fragments. Warmth. A fireplace. Blankets piled high. Dalton's weathered face looking down at her with concern that seemed genuine. You're safe now, he'd said. Storm's too bad to get you home tonight, but you're safe. The blizzard had lasted 3 days. 3 days trapped in Dalton Reeves' sprawling ranch house while the world outside disappeared behind walls of white. 3 days of slow conversation across the dinner table, of sharing stories to pass the time, of discovering that the fearsome rancher was also a man who read poetry by lamplight and played piano with surprising gentleness. 3 days that had led to one night when loneliness had overwhelmed propriety. Margaret closed her eyes against the memory. It hadn't been reckless. It hadn't been cheap. It had been 2 people, both worn down by years of solitude, finding unexpected comfort in each other. She'd known, even as it happened, that it couldn't last beyond those snow-locked walls. Men like Dalton Reeves didn't build futures with aging widows who mended coats for pennies. When the roads had cleared, he'd driven her home himself, his eyes steady and unreadable. What happened stays between us, he'd said, not unkindly. Small towns protect power, Margaret, not truth. Remember that. She'd nodded, understanding perfectly. He was right, of course. If word got out that they'd been alone together for 3 days, Never mind what had actually occurred, both their reputations would suffer. Though his would survive, as powerful men's reputations always did, while hers would be destroyed entirely. So she'd kept silent, and now she was paying the price for that silence. November arrived with bitter winds and the first hard freeze. Margaret could no longer hide the changes to her body. Her dresses, even the loosest ones, strained across her middle. She took to wearing her late husband's old coat when she went out, grateful for its shapeless bulk. But Red Hollow was a small town, and in small towns, nothing stays hidden forever. The first direct comment came from Martha Gaines at the general store. Margaret was purchasing thread and flour, counting out coins carefully from her dwindling savings, when Martha leaned across the counter with false sweetness. "My, Margaret, you're looking rather full these days. Been eating well?" The implication hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds. "Just the usual," Margaret replied, keeping her voice neutral. Well, it's good to see you keeping your strength up. A woman your age needs to be careful about her health." There it was again. A woman your age. As if being 52 meant she'd forfeited the right to exist in any state other than quiet deterioration. Margaret paid for her purchases and left quickly, but she could feel Martha's eyes boring into her back, could practically hear the gossip forming in the other woman's mind. After that, the whispers began in earnest. She heard them in the pause when she entered the post office, saw them in the sideways glances outside the church, felt them in the way conversation stopped when she approached and resumed with forced cheerfulness after she passed. Red Hollow was talking. And what they were saying was impossible, scandalous, shameful. By mid-November, Margaret's condition could no longer be disguised. Her belly had rounded distinctly, unmistakably. She stopped attending church, stopped going to the general store except when absolutely necessary. She took in fewer mending jobs, unable to face the barely concealed judgment in her clients' eyes. The isolation was suffocating. One cold afternoon, as she sat at her work table trying to focus on repairing a torn shirt, someone pounded on her door. The sound was aggressive, official. Margaret's heart sank. She knew that knock. She opened the door to find Sheriff Warren Dixon standing on her step, his face set in grim lines. Behind him, Constance Fletcher and two church elders, Mr. Parsons and Mr. Webb, clustered like vultures. "Mrs. Hale," the sheriff said, removing his hat in a gesture that was more formality than respect. "May we come in?" It wasn't really a question. Margaret stepped aside, her stomach churning with dread. The four of them filed into her small front room, filling it with judgment and condemnation. Constance spoke first, her voice dripping with false concern. "Margaret, dear, we've come as friends. We're worried about you." "Worried," Mr. Parsons echoed, his jowls quivering with righteous indignation. "Worried about your immortal soul." Margaret remained standing, refusing to offer them seats. "I don't know what you mean." Sheriff Dixon sighed, clearly uncomfortable with his role, but committed to playing it. "Mrs. Hale, let's not play games. The whole town can see your condition. It's become a topic of considerable concern. My health is my own business. Not when it affects the moral character of our community," Mr. Webb interjected. He was a thin man with a thin voice, but his eyes were hard. "You're unmarried. You're not young, and yet you appear to be—" He couldn't quite bring himself to say the word. "Pregnant," Constance finished for him, the word sharp as a slap. "There, I've said it. You're pregnant, Margaret, and it's shameful, absolutely shameful." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame but from anger. "I'm 52 years old. What you're suggesting is exactly what everyone can see with their own eyes," Sheriff Dixon interrupted. "Look, Mrs. Hale, nobody wants to make this uglier than it needs to be. But you need to understand the position you're putting this town in. We have standards. We have children who look up to their elders. We can't have—" He gestured vaguely at her midsection. "This kind of scandal out in the open." "What exactly are you asking me to do?" The four visitors exchanged glances. Mr. Parsons cleared his throat. "We think it would be best if you went away for a while, until this situation resolves itself. There's a home for unfortunate women in Denver. They're very discreet. Margaret's hands clenched into fists at her sides. You want me to go into hiding, to pretend this isn't happening. We want you to do what's right, Constance said primly, for yourself and for this community. And if I refuse? Sheriff Dixon's expression hardened. Then we'll have to consider other options. I've got authority to remove individuals who pose a moral threat to public decency. I'd rather not use it, but I will if necessary. Exile. They were threatening her with exile from her own home. Margaret looked at each of them in turn, the sheriff with his reluctant authority, the church elders with their righteous fury, Constance with her eager malice. None of them cared about her well-being. They cared about maintaining the comfortable fiction that women like her didn't exist, that desire and consequence belonged only to the young and married. Get out, she said quietly. Mrs. Hale, get out of my house. They left, but not before Mr. Webb delivered a parting shot. You'll be called before the town council next week. I suggest you prepare yourself to answer some very difficult questions. The door closed behind them, and Margaret was alone again. She sank into her chair, hands pressed against her swollen belly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself to cry. The week that followed was the longest of Margaret's life. She barely slept. When she did, her dreams were filled with hostile faces and pointing fingers. She couldn't eat more than a few bites at each meal before her stomach rebelled. The baby, because it was real now, undeniable, moving inside her with tiny flutters that both terrified and amazed her, seemed to sense her distress. She thought about running, packing what little she owned and disappearing before the town council could convene. But where would she go? She had maybe $40 to her name, no family left alive, no friends who would risk their own reputations to help her. She thought about going to Dalton, telling him what was happening. But the memory of his warning echoed in her mind. Small towns protect power, not truth. He'd been right, even if he wanted to help her, and why would he? She'd been a momentary comfort during a snowstorm, nothing more. Doing so would mean exposing what had happened between them. It would ruin her completely, and damage him as well. No, she had to face this alone. The summons came on Thursday afternoon. An official-looking paper delivered by Sheriff Dixon himself, informing her that her presence was required at the town hall on Saturday at 2 o'clock sharp. Margaret read it 3 times, each word burning itself into her memory. The Council of Red Hollow requires the presence of Mrs. Margaret Hale to address matters of public concern regarding moral conduct and community standards. Matters of public concern. As if her body, her private choices, belonged to the collective judgment of every self-righteous citizen who'd never known hardship or loneliness. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. Margaret dressed carefully in her most modest dress, dark blue with a high collar, though it strained across her belly in a way that made concealment impossible. She pinned her graying hair up severely, applied no color to her lips or cheeks. She wanted to appear as respectable as possible, though she knew it wouldn't matter. The walk to town hall felt like a death march. Red Hollow's main street was busier than usual for a Saturday afternoon. As Margaret made her way toward the square, she realized with growing horror that word of the council meeting had spread. People were gathering, not just the council members, but spectators, citizens who'd come to watch her public humiliation. The town hall stood at the center of Red Hollow, a 2-story wooden structure that served multiple purposes: government offices, courtroom, and community gathering space. Today, it would serve as her tribunal. Margaret climbed the steps with her head high, refusing to show the terror that clawed at her insides. The main hall was already packed, every chair filled, people standing along the walls. She recognized most of them, neighbors, former clients, people she'd lived among for decades. Their faces showed varying degrees of curiosity, judgment, and poorly concealed excitement at the drama about to unfold. A table had been set up at the front of the room. Behind it sat 5 council members. Mayor Thomas Blackwood in the center, flanked by the 2 church elders who'd visited her earlier, plus Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the school teacher, and Mr. Silas Granger, who owned the largest store in town. Sheriff Dixon guided Margaret to a single chair positioned in front of the table, facing both the council and the crowd. It was deliberately positioned to maximize her exposure, her vulnerability. Mayor Blackwood called the meeting to order by rapping his gavel 3 times. The room fell silent. "We're here today," he began, his voice carrying easily in the hushed space, to address a matter that has become a source of considerable concern for our community. Mrs. Margaret Hale, you stand before this council and your fellow citizens to answer questions regarding your current condition. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Now, Mrs. Hale, let me be direct. You're an unmarried woman of considerable age who appears to be with child. This has caused no small amount of scandal in our town. Do you have anything to say to these charges? Charges. As if pregnancy were a crime. Margaret's voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm not sure what you're asking me to confess to, Mayor Blackwood. My personal health is... Your personal health became public business the moment you started showing, Mr. Parsons interrupted harshly. You're a member of this community, Mrs. Hale. You attend our church. Children see you on the streets. And now you parade around in a state that is nothing short of disgraceful for a woman your age. I haven't paraded anywhere, Margaret said quietly. I've lived quietly, as I always have. Quietly? Constance Fletcher's voice rang out from the crowd. She'd positioned herself in the front row, apparently unable to resist participating. You call this quiet? The whole town's talking about nothing else. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. Mrs. Thornton, the schoolteacher, leaned forward. Her voice was gentler than the men's, but no less pointed. Margaret, dear, we're trying to understand. At your age, this pregnancy is not only scandalous, but medically improbable, which leads us to wonder about the circumstances of its occurrence. There it was, the question they all wanted answered but were too polite to ask directly. Who fathered the child? Margaret's hands gripped the edge of her chair. She'd known this moment was coming, had rehearsed a dozen different responses. But now, faced with the collective judgment of an entire town, every prepared answer evaporated. Mayor Blackwood pressed on. Mrs. Hale, I think you understand what we're asking. The identity of the father is a matter of some importance. If a crime has been committed, if someone took advantage of you, then justice demands that person be held accountable. It was almost funny, Margaret thought distantly. They were offering her an out, a chance to claim victimhood, to position herself as prey rather than participant. It would be easier, in some ways. It would transform her from scandal to tragedy. But it would also be a lie, and it would drag Dalton into this nightmare. No crime was committed, she said firmly. Then you admit there was a liaison? Mr. Webb's nose wrinkled with distaste. I admit nothing. Mrs. Hale, you have no right to interrogate me about my private life, Margaret said, her voice rising despite her attempts to stay calm. I've broken no laws. I've harmed no one. What's happened to me is between me and who? Mr. Parsons demanded. Who is the father, Mrs. Hale? You owe this community the truth. The crowd was growing restless now, energized by the confrontation. Someone shouted from the back, She's protecting him. Must be someone married. Another voice, Probably someone important. That's why she won't say. The speculation spread like fire, each person adding their own theory, their own condemnation. Sheriff Dixon stood, raising his hands for quiet. Folks, let's maintain order here. Mrs. Hale, you need to understand the seriousness of this situation. If you refuse to cooperate, this council has the authority to... The door at the back of the hall burst open. Every head turned. The late afternoon sun streamed through the opening, silhouetting the figure that stood framed in the doorway. For a moment, nobody could make out who it was. Then he stepped forward into the light, and collective gasps echoed through the room. Dalton Reeves. He strode down the center aisle with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. At 58, he was still imposing, well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that could freeze or warm depending on his mood. Today they were cold as winter steel. The crowd parted before him automatically. Margaret's heart stopped, then restarted at double speed. What was he doing here? How did he even know about the meeting? Dalton reached her chair and stopped, positioning himself slightly in front of her. Not quite shielding her from view, but close, a subtle statement of protection. He turned to face the council. Gentlemen, Mrs. Thornton. His voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. I believe I can answer the question that seems to be causing so much distress. Mayor Blackwood's face had gone pale. Mr. Reeves, this is highly irregular. This is a closed council meeting. Nothing closed about it, Tom. Half the town's in here. Dalton's eyes swept the crowd, and several people shifted uncomfortably. Seems to me if you're going to put a woman on trial for the crime of being pregnant, you ought to at least have the courage to do it in private. Now see here, Mr. Parsons sputtered. We're not putting anyone on trial. We're simply trying to maintain community standards by humiliating a decent woman in front of her neighbors. That woman is pregnant out of wedlock at an age when it's not only scandalous, but that woman, Dalton interrupted coldly, is sitting right here. You could try addressing her directly instead of talking about her like she's not in the room. Silence fell. Margaret could barely breathe. Every eye in the hall was fixed on Dalton, waiting. He turned slightly, his gaze finding hers. Something passed between them in that moment. A question, maybe, or a request for permission. Margaret gave the smallest nod. Dalton turned back to the council. You want to know who fathered that child, he said, each word clear and deliberate. I'll tell you. The room held its collective breath. I did. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. Gasps, murmurs. Someone laughed nervously, as if this had to be a joke, but Dalton's face was stone serious. That child is mine, he repeated. Mrs. Hale and I became close during the blizzard last February, when she was stranded at my ranch. What happened between us is our business, but I'll be damned if I'm going to let her face this pack of hypocrites alone while I hide behind my reputation. Mayor Blackwood had gone from pale to bright red. Mr. Reeves, are you seriously admitting to what? To being human? To finding comfort with a good woman during a time when we were both lonely? Yes, Tom, I'm admitting to exactly that. Mr. Webb stood abruptly. This is outrageous. The impropriety, the sheer moral bankruptcy, Dalton cut him off, his voice dropping to something dangerous, is right here in this room. You people should be ashamed of yourselves. You've known Margaret Hale for decades. She's worked hard, lived quietly, hurt nobody. And the moment something happens that doesn't fit your narrow view of how the world should work, you turn on her like wolves. He stepped fully in front of Margaret now, his broad back a barrier between her and the council. Well, let me make something clear. That child is mine. Mrs. Hale is under my protection, and if anyone in this town has a problem with that— His eyes swept the room, meeting and holding the gaze of anyone brave enough to look. They can take it up with me personally. The challenge hung in the air. Nobody moved. Dalton held out his hand to Margaret. Come on, we're leaving. Margaret took his hand and stood on trembling legs. The room was utterly silent as Dalton escorted her up the aisle, his hand at the small of her back, steady and sure. They were almost to the door when Constance Fletcher's voice shrieked out, You can't just leave. The council hasn't dismissed her. Dalton paused, turned back. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but somehow that made it more threatening. Watch me. And then they were outside, the door swinging shut behind them, cutting off the explosion of voices that erupted in their wake. Margaret stood on the town hall steps, dizzy with adrenaline and disbelief. Dalton's wagon was tied up right outside, as if he'd planned this rescue down to the last detail. He helped her up onto the seat with surprising gentleness, then climbed up beside her. The reins were in his hands, and they were moving before Margaret could find her voice. Dalton, what have you done? She whispered. He didn't answer immediately, his attention on guiding the horses through the street. People had spilled out of the town hall now, standing in clusters, watching them leave. Margaret could feel their stares like physical weight. Only when they'd cleared the edge of town did Dalton finally respond. What needed doing? He said quietly. I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner. You've ruined your reputation. My reputation will survive. Always does when you've got enough land and money. He glanced at her, and his expression softened slightly. Besides, what good is a reputation if you build it on cowardice? Margaret's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. They'll never forgive you for this, for choosing me. Then they'll have to stay unforgiving. His jaw set in a line she was beginning to recognize as stubbornness. You're coming to the ranch. Tonight. For good, if you'll have it. Dalton, I should have asked you to stay back in February. Should have made it clear that what happened between us wasn't just convenience. I was a coward, Margaret. Told myself I was protecting you by keeping distance. But really, I was protecting myself. Too damn scared of what people would think, of what it would mean to care about someone again. The wagon rattled over a rough patch of road. In the distance, Margaret could see the outline of the Reeves ranch, sprawling and solid against the darkening sky. I'm 52 years old, she said softly. I'm going to have a baby, your baby. Do you understand how impossible that sounds? I understand it's happening. That's all that matters. People will talk. They'll say terrible things. Let them talk. Margaret turned to look at him fully. In the fading light, his profile was strong and certain. This man who commanded respect through force of will and accumulated power had just thrown both away to stand beside her. Why? She asked. Why would you do this? Dalton was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Because that night, when I found you in the snow, half frozen and barely conscious, something in my chest cracked open. Because those 3 days we spent talking while the storm raged outside were the first time in a decade I felt like a human being instead of just a landowner. Because when you left, my house felt emptier than it had in all the years I'd lived there alone. He swallowed hard. Because I've spent 7 months trying to convince myself that what I felt was temporary. And because the moment I heard they were putting you on trial for the crime of carrying my child, I realized I was done lying to myself. The ranch house came into view, a sprawling 2-story structure with warm light glowing in the windows. Home. It looked like home. I'm scared, Margaret admitted. So am I. What if something goes wrong? Women my age, we'll deal with whatever comes, together. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. A woman appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper Dalton had employed for years. She took in the scene with shrewd eyes, but said nothing, simply nodding in acknowledgement. Dalton helped Margaret down from the wagon with infinite care. As her feet touched the ground, she swayed slightly, overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. He steadied her, his hands strong and warm on her arms. You're safe now, he said, echoing the first words he'd spoken to her all those months ago. I promise you, Margaret, you're safe. And standing there in the gathering dusk, with the most powerful man in 3 counties holding her like she was something precious, Margaret allowed herself to believe it might be true. The Reeves ranch house smelled of pine and leather and something cooking in the kitchen that made Margaret's empty stomach clench with hunger. Mrs. Chen disappeared briefly, then returned with a tray bearing tea and bread still warm from the oven. Guest room is ready upstairs, the housekeeper said to Dalton, her accent thick but her English clear. I put extra blankets. Gets cold at night. Thank you, Lee. Dalton turned to Margaret. Mrs. Chen's been with me for 8 years. She doesn't gossip, doesn't judge, and makes the best dumplings in 3 counties. The older woman's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. You eat, she said to Margaret, gesturing at the tray. Too thin. Baby needs more. Then she was gone, her footsteps retreating toward the kitchen, leaving Margaret alone with Dalton in the large front room. The space was masculine, but not harsh. Worn leather furniture, a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, bookshelves lining 2 walls. Through the windows, the last light was draining from the sky, turning the distant mountains purple. Margaret sank into one of the chairs, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the town hall confrontation was fading, leaving her hollow and shaking. Drink the tea, Dalton said quietly. He'd moved to the fireplace, was building up the fire with practiced efficiency. You look like you're about to collapse. She obeyed, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. The first sip settled her stomach slightly. I left everything behind. My house, my work, everything. I'll send someone tomorrow to collect your things, whatever you need. They'll have broken in by now, Constance Fletcher and her friends. They'll be going through my belongings, looking for evidence of sin. Dalton's jaw tightened, but he kept his attention on the fire. Let them look. They won't find anything worth their trouble. He stood, brushing ash from his hands. And if they damage anything, I'll see they pay for it. You can't fight the whole town. Watch me. Margaret set down the teacup with a hand that trembled slightly. You still haven't told me how you knew about the council meeting. Bobby Marsh came to the ranch this morning, works at the livery stable, does odd jobs for me sometimes. Said the whole town was talking about it, that they were planning to run you out. Dalton's expression darkened. Said some of the men were even talking about tar and feathers, though I don't think they'd have had the courage to actually do it. The image sent ice through Margaret's veins. She'd heard stories of such things, though always in the context of criminals and traitors, not widows whose only crime was an unexpected pregnancy. So you came. So I came. He crossed to the window, stared out at the gathering darkness. I should have come sooner, should have checked on you weeks ago, but I convinced myself that distance was kindness, that if I stayed away, the gossip would die down and you'd be left in peace. You couldn't have known it would get this bad. I should have known. This town, he shook his head. Red Hollow likes to think of itself as civilized, but scratch the surface and it's just fear and judgment all the way down. They can't stand anything that doesn't fit their narrow view of how life should look. Margaret forced herself to take a bite of bread. It was good, better than anything she'd baked in months, but it sat heavy in her stomach. What happens now? Now you rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out the details. He turned back to face her. But I meant what I said in that hall, Margaret. You're under my protection. You and the baby both. People will assume that we've been having an affair? A bitter smile crossed his face. Let them assume what they want. We'll know the truth. Which is... Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. The truth is that I've been half in love with you since those days during the blizzard. The truth is that I was too much a coward to admit it, even to myself. The truth is that when I saw you sitting in that chair today, facing down that pack of self-righteous hypocrites alone, something in me broke. He moved closer, knelt down so they were eye level. The truth is that I want you here, Margaret, not out of obligation, not because it's the proper thing to do, but because the thought of you leaving makes this house feel like a tomb again. Margaret's throat tightened. I'm 52 years old, Dalton. I'm going to have a baby that everyone will call a bastard. I come with nothing but scandal and shame. You come with strength and dignity that half the people in Red Hollow couldn't muster if they lived 3 lifetimes. His hand covered hers, warm and calloused. And that baby is mine, Margaret. Mine. No one gets to call my child anything but what he or she is. Wanted. Loved. Mine. A tear escaped down Margaret's cheek before she could stop it. Dalton reached up, wiped it away with surprising gentleness. Stay, he said simply. Please. And what could she say to that? What choice did she have, really, except to trust this man who'd stood up in front of the entire town and claimed her when he could have stayed silent? I'll stay, she whispered. Something eased in Dalton's expression, a tension she hadn't fully registered draining away. He stood, offered his hand to help her up. Come on, Mrs. Chen will have my hide if I don't get some proper food into you. The dining room was smaller than Margaret had expected, more intimate. A table that could seat 8 but was currently set for 2, positioned near another fireplace. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself. Roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots glazed with honey, fresh bread. Margaret's mouth watered despite her churning emotions. They ate in companionable silence at first. Margaret was ravenous, she realized. She couldn't remember the last proper meal she'd had. For weeks she'd been surviving on bread and weak tea, her appetite killed by anxiety and morning sickness. Slow down, Dalton said gently. Food's not going anywhere. Margaret flushed, embarrassed to be caught eating like a starving woman. But Dalton's expression held no judgment, only concern. Sorry, I haven't been able to keep much down lately. Mrs. Chen's cooking has that effect. First time I tasted her dumplings, I nearly proposed marriage on the spot. He paused. That was a joke, poor one maybe. A surprised laugh bubbled up from Margaret's chest. It felt strange, that sound. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. Dalton smiled, and the expression transformed his face. He was handsome, she realized. Not in the conventional way. His features were too rough, too weathered by years of outdoor work. But there was something compelling in the lines of his face, the steadiness of his gaze. Tell me about your son, Margaret said, seizing on a neutral topic. I know he exists, but I've never met him. Dalton's expression grew complicated. James. He's 26 now, manages the north section of the ranch. Good with horses, better with cattle. Got his mother's temperament, thank heavens. Calm where I'm quick to anger. Does he live here? Has his own place about 2 miles north. Prefers his independence. Dalton set down his fork. I sent word to him this afternoon. Told him what was happening, that you'd be staying here. He'll have questions. He'll be angry that you've taken in a pregnant widow who's causing a scandal. He'll be surprised. But James is a good man. He'll come around. Dalton didn't sound entirely convinced, but Margaret appreciated the attempt at reassurance. They finished the meal in quiet conversation about safer topics. The ranch, the changing weather, the livestock. Normal things that felt surreal, given the circumstances. When Mrs. Chen came to clear the plates, she fixed Margaret with a stern look. You sleep now. Baby needs rest. I'm fine, really. You sleep, the housekeeper repeated, brooking no argument. She turned to Dalton. You make sure. She looks like Ghost. After Mrs. Chen retreated to the kitchen, Dalton stood and offered his arm. She's right. You've been through hell today. Let me show you to your room. The stairs creaked softly under their feet. The upstairs hallway was lined with doors, most of them closed. Dalton led her to one near the end, pushed it open to reveal a bedroom that was easily twice the size of her entire cottage. A large bed dominated the space, already turned down with crisp white sheets and a heavy quilt. A dresser, a wardrobe, a small sitting area near the window. A door in the corner that presumably led to a washroom. It's too much, Margaret breathed. It's what you deserve. Dalton moved to the dresser, pulled out a nightgown that looked new. Mrs. Chen must have bought this when I sent word you were coming. She's efficient like that. Margaret took the garment, soft cotton that probably cost more than she earned in a month of mending. Dalton, I can't repay you for any of this. I don't want repayment. I want you safe and healthy. He moved toward the door, then paused. My room's right next door if you need anything. Don't hesitate to knock, no matter what time. Thank you, Margaret said, the words inadequate for everything she was feeling. Dalton nodded, his hand on the doorknob. Margaret? What I said earlier about being half in love with you. That was a lie. Her heart sank. I'm all the way in love with you. Have been for months. Just thought you should know. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Margaret standing in the middle of the too large room with her heart hammering against her ribs. She changed into the nightgown mechanically, her mind replaying his words. In love with her. Dalton Reeves, the most powerful rancher in 3 counties, was in love with a 52-year-old widow who mended coats and was pregnant with his child. It should have felt like a fairy tale. Instead, it felt terrifying. Margaret climbed into the bed, sank into mattress softer than anything she'd slept on in years. Through the window, she could see stars emerging in the clear night sky, bright and distant. Her hand moved to her belly, feeling the slight swell there. Your father just turned both our lives upside down, she whispered to the life growing inside her. I hope you're worth all this trouble. The baby kicked, a tiny flutter against her palm that might have been imagination. Margaret closed her eyes and, for the first time in months, slept without fear. She woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The town hall, Dalton's declaration, the drive to the ranch. Someone had left a dress draped over the chair near the bed. Dark green wool, simple but well made. Margaret examined it and realized with a start that it would actually fit her changing body. Had Dalton guessed at her measurements? Or had Mrs. Chen's practiced eye simply known what was needed? She washed using the basin on the dresser, dressed carefully, and made her way downstairs. Voices drifted from the kitchen, Dalton's deep rumble and Mrs. Chen's clipped responses. Margaret paused in the doorway, suddenly uncertain of her welcome in the morning light. Dalton looked up, saw her, and his expression softened. Morning, coffee? Please? Mrs. Chen was already moving, pouring a cup from the pot on the stove. She pressed it into Margaret's hands along with a stern look. You eat breakfast. I make eggs. I don't want to be any trouble. No trouble. Sit. Margaret sat at this kitchen table, feeling oddly like a child being managed by competent adults. Dalton joined her, his own cup steaming in front of him. Sleep well? Better than I have in months. Margaret sipped the coffee, strong and hot and perfect. This is all very strange. Which part? All of it. Yesterday I was being interrogated by the town council. Today I'm having breakfast in Dalton Reeves' kitchen like it's the most natural thing in the world. It is natural, or it will be, given time. He studied her over the rim of his cup. I sent Charlie out at first light to collect your things from the cottage. He should be back within the hour. Margaret's chest tightened. What if they've destroyed everything? Then we'll replace it. But I'm betting Constance and her friends are all talk. They might have pawed through your belongings. But actual destruction? That takes a courage they don't possess, Mrs. Chen set a plate in front of Margaret. Scrambled eggs, toast, a slice of ham. The sight made Margaret's stomach growl audibly. She ate while Dalton outlined his plans for the day with the efficiency of a man accustomed to managing large operations. I need to ride out to the north pasture, check on the herd. Should be back by afternoon. Mrs. Chen will be here if you need anything. He paused. You're free to explore the house, the grounds, whatever you like. This is your home now, Margaret. I want you to feel comfortable here. What about your son? When will he... The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut her off. Dalton's expression shifted, became more guarded. That would be him now. Through the window, Margaret watched a young man dismount from a chestnut mare with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. He was tall like his father, though leaner, with lighter hair and a face that was almost pretty in its symmetry. James Reeves tied his horse to the rail and strode toward the house with purpose. Dalton stood. Let me talk to him first. No. Margaret rose as well, setting down her napkin with hands that wanted to shake. I'm not hiding. If he has questions, he can ask me directly. Something flickered in Dalton's eyes. Respect, maybe, or pride. All right then. The front door opened, closed. Footsteps in the hall. Then James appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes going immediately to Margaret. So it's true, he said without preamble. You actually brought her here. James, Dalton's voice carried a warning. Mind your manners. My manners? James laughed, but there was no humor in it. The whole county's talking about how Dalton Reeves stood up in front of everyone and claimed he got a woman old enough to be... He stopped himself, seeming to realize how that sentence would end. Old enough to be what? Margaret asked quietly. Your mother? She would have been, if she'd lived. I'm 52, James. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. James had the grace to look uncomfortable. He turned to his father. Can we talk? Privately? Anything you have to say, you can say in front of Margaret. Fine. James crossed his arms, his stance aggressive. Have you lost your mind? Do you have any idea what you've done to this family's reputation, to the ranch's standing in the community? I've told the truth. That's all. The truth? James's voice rose. The truth is that you had an affair with a woman half the town thinks is too old to even... He stopped again, clearly struggling with how to articulate what he was feeling. Too old to what? Dalton's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Finish that sentence, son. To be having a baby. There, I said it. It's unnatural. It's biology, Margaret interrupted, her own anger rising now despite her determination to stay calm. Unlikely, yes. Uncommon at my age, certainly, but not impossible, as I'm living proof. And I won't apologize for it, to you or anyone else. James stared at her, clearly not accustomed to being challenged. You've ruined him. You know that, right? The Reeves name meant something in this territory. Now it's going to be a joke. Then let it be a joke, Dalton said flatly. I don't give a damn about the Reeves name if protecting it means abandoning the woman carrying my child. She trapped you. Can't you see that? She got pregnant on purpose, knowing you'd feel obligated to... Dalton moved so fast Margaret barely registered it. One moment he was standing by the table, the next he was nose to nose with his son, his voice low and furious. You will not speak about Margaret that way. Not in this house. Not anywhere. Do you understand me? James held his ground, but his face had paled. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Then everyone's a fool. Margaret didn't trap me. She didn't ask for any of this. If anything, I'm the one who failed her by staying away when she needed support. Dalton stepped back, ran a hand through his hair. I know this is hard for you to understand. I know it's not what you expected. But this is happening, James. Margaret is staying here. The baby is coming. And I would very much like my son to be part of this family instead of standing outside it, throwing stones. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Mrs. Chen had disappeared at some point, leaving the three of them to work through this confrontation alone. James looked at Margaret again, his expression conflicted. If this is real, if you're really expecting, then you should know that pregnancy at your age is dangerous. My mother died in childbirth. I was 6 years old. I watched my father fall apart for years after. If you think I'm going to stand by and watch that happen again, James, Margaret's voice was gentler now, understanding dawning. This wasn't just about scandal or reputation. This was about fear. I know the risks. Believe me, I've thought of little else for months, but I can't change what's happening. I can only move forward and hope that whatever outcome awaits, I'll have the strength to face it. And what about him? James gestured at his father. What happens to him if you die? If the baby dies? Have you thought about that? Every day, Margaret admitted. But I can't live my life or end it based on what might happen. None of us can. James was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he turned to Dalton. You're sure about this? About her? More sure than I've been about anything in a decade. And if the town turns on you? If they stop doing business with the ranch? Then they weren't worth doing business with in the first place. James shook his head, clearly not happy, but perhaps beginning to accept the inevitable. You're both insane. You know that, right? Probably, Dalton agreed, but it's our insanity to own. The younger man moved toward the door, then paused. When he looked back at Margaret, his expression was still wary, but perhaps fractionally less hostile. I hope you know what you're doing, he said. Then to his father, I'll be at the north pasture if you need me. After he left, the silence stretched out. Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted despite having just woken. That went well? She said dryly. Dalton gave a short laugh. About as well as I expected. James needs time. He'll come around. Or he won't. He will. He's stubborn, but he's not cruel. Once he gets past the shock, he'll see what I see, a strong woman who's doing the best she can in an impossible situation. Margaret wished she felt as confident. She drained the last of her coffee, now gone cold. What do I do here, Dalton? I can't just sit idle. I'm not built for it. What do you want to do? I don't know. Something useful. I've spent my whole adult life working. The thought of being kept, it doesn't sit right. Dalton considered this. The ranch accounts are a mess. My bookkeeper quit last month and I haven't replaced him. If you've got a head for numbers, I kept Thomas books for years. Nothing fancy, but I can balance accounts. Then the job's yours if you want it. I'll pay fair wages, same as I paid Henderson. It was exactly what Margaret needed. Purpose, contribution, a way to feel less like a charity case. I'd like that. Thank you. Don't thank me. You'll earn every penny once you see the state of those ledgers. He glanced at the clock. I really do need to get out to that pasture. Will you be all right here? I'll be fine. Mrs. Chen terrifies me too much to cause any trouble. That earned her another smile. Dalton collected his hat from the peg by the door, then paused. Margaret, what James said about his mother. I know the risks, Dalton. I'm not naive yet. But you should know that I've already sent word to Denver for a doctor, someone with experience in difficult pregnancies. He'll be here next week to examine you, make sure everything's progressing as it should. The gesture touched her more than she wanted to admit. That must be expensive. I don't care what it costs. I won't lose you. Not to childbirth, not to complications, not to anything. His voice was fierce. Whatever it takes to keep you and the baby safe, that's what we'll do. After he left, Margaret sat in the quiet kitchen and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened in the last 24 hours. Her life had been completely upended. Everything she'd known, every careful routine she'd built, had been shattered. And yet, sitting in this warm kitchen with the sun streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee still hanging in the air, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, Mrs. Chen reappeared with fresh coffee and a knowing look. That boy, he come around. You see? Just scared. We're all scared, Margaret admitted. Scared good sometimes. Means you care about something. The housekeeper poured herself a cup, sat down across from Margaret with the familiarity of someone who'd earned her place in this household. You good for him. Boss needs someone with spine. Too many people bow and scrape, tell him what he wants to hear. You tell truth. The truth hasn't made me very popular lately. Popular overrated. Better to be honest. Mrs. Chen sipped her coffee, studying Margaret over the rim. You strong. You need to be. Hard times coming. Harder than what's already happened. Baby coming early, I can tell. 2, maybe 3 months early. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her belly. How can you know that? I deliver many babies in old country. I know signs. Your body, she gestured vaguely. Working too hard. Baby getting ready. Fear spiked through Margaret's chest. But it's too soon. I'm barely 6 months along. Sometimes baby decides. We prepare. We be ready. Mrs. Chen's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a potentially life-threatening complication. You rest much. No stress. Eat good. Give baby best chance. A wagon rattled up outside, Charlie returning with Margaret's belongings, presumably. Mrs. Chen rose to direct him, leaving Margaret alone with her spiraling thoughts. A premature baby. Another risk to add to the already considerable list. Another way this could all go horribly wrong. Margaret pressed both hands against her stomach, feeling the slight movements within. You stay put, she whispered. A few more months at least. Please. The afternoon passed in a strange blur. Charlie brought in Margaret's things. Surprisingly, nothing had been damaged, though her belongings had clearly been rifled through. She spent an hour unpacking, hanging her few dresses in the massive wardrobe, arranging her sewing supplies on the dresser. It felt both temporary and permanent, this claiming of space in Dalton's house. Lunch was soup and bread, eaten in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, who kept up a steady stream of conversation about the ranch, the weather, anything but the elephant in the room. Margaret was grateful for the normalcy, even if it was an illusion. In the early afternoon, Dalton returned, dusty and tired but satisfied with whatever he'd found in the north pasture. He found Margaret in his study, staring in dismay at the chaos that was his bookkeeping system. I warned you it was bad, he said from the doorway. Bad doesn't begin to cover it. When's the last time these were properly organized? Henderson quit in August. Before that, I'm honestly not sure. Margaret picked up a stack of receipts, some dating back more than a year. This is going to take weeks to sort out. Then it's a good thing you're not going anywhere. She looked up at him, this man who'd upended his life for her, and felt that flutter of hope again. Dangerous, that feeling. Hope could hurt worse than anything when it was proven false. But looking at Dalton's steady gaze, Margaret thought maybe, just maybe, it might be worth the risk. The weeks that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Margaret rose each morning to find breakfast already prepared, spent her days wrestling Dalton's chaotic accounts into some semblance of order, and joined him for dinner in the small dining room where they talked about everything and nothing. It was domestic in a way Margaret's marriage to Thomas had never been. There was conversation here, genuine interest in each other's thoughts. Dalton asked her opinions on ranch matters and actually listened to her answers. She found herself looking forward to the evenings, to the way firelight softened the harsh lines of his face when he smiled. But Red Hollow hadn't forgotten. If anything, the town's fury had intensified in the wake of Dalton's public declaration. The first sign came 3 days after Margaret had moved to the ranch. Dalton returned from town with a grim expression and news that Morrison's Feed and Supply had refused to sell him grain. Said his customers wouldn't appreciate him doing business with someone who flaunts immorality, Dalton reported, tossing his hat onto the side table with more force than necessary. Chet Morrison, who I've pulled out of debt twice in the last 5 years, who came begging for extended credit just last winter. Margaret looked up from the ledger she'd been working on, guilt twisting in her stomach. This is because of me. This is because of small-minded men who think they have the right to dictate other people's lives. Dalton poured himself a whiskey, drained half of it in one swallow. We'll order grain from Silverton. It's farther, costs more, but at least they're not hypocrites. Dalton, if this continues, if other businesses start refusing to work with you, then we'll find other businesses. The ranch has survived droughts, harsh winters, and cattle plagues. It'll survive Chet Morrison's moral outrage. But Morrison wasn't the only one. Over the following days, word came that the bank had questions about the ranch's line of credit. The veterinarian who'd served the Reeves Ranch for a decade suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Even the postal service seemed to deliver their mail with pointed reluctance. Margaret watched it happen with growing dread. She'd known there would be consequences, but seeing them manifest in concrete ways, seeing Dalton's business relationships crumble because of her, was agony. "You should send me away," she said one evening over dinner. "Tell people it was a mistake, that you were being chivalrous, but I've decided to leave anyway. Your reputation could recover." "No. Dalton, no." He set down his fork, his eyes intense. "We've had this conversation 3 times now, Margaret. My answer isn't going to change. You're staying. They can ostracize me, refuse to do business with me, whisper behind their hands all they want. I don't care. But the ranch, we'll be fine. I've got contracts with buyers in Denver and Kansas City. The cattle don't care about scandal. The land doesn't give a damn about gossip." He reached across the table, covered her hand with his. "What I won't do is send you back to that town to face their judgment alone. That's not negotiable." Mrs. Chen, clearing plates from the sideboard, made a sound of approval. "Boss stubborn," she said to Margaret. "You stubborn too. Good match." Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. The housekeeper had proven to be an unexpected ally, offering practical advice about the pregnancy with the same no-nonsense efficiency she applied to running the household. She'd also taken to leaving ginger tea by Margaret's bedside each morning, which helped considerably with the lingering nausea. The doctor from Denver arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, riding up in a hired carriage that looked out of place against the rough landscape. Doctor. Samuel Brennan was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 40, with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that looked too clean to belong to someone who worked for a living. Dalton had arranged for the examination to take place in Margaret's room, with Mrs. Chen present as a chaperone. The doctor was thorough and surprisingly gentle, asking questions about her health history, her symptoms, the timeline of the pregnancy. "Your pulse is strong," he said, helping her sit up after the examination. "The baby's position feels good, but Mrs. Chen was right to be concerned about premature labor. Your body's showing signs of stress." "What kind of stress?" Dalton asked from where he stood by the door. He'd insisted on being nearby, though propriety dictated he remain outside during the actual examination. Dr. Brennan removed his spectacles, cleaned them with a handkerchief. "The kind that comes from anxiety, inadequate nutrition in the months before I arrived, and the simple biological fact that pregnancy at 52 puts enormous strain on the system." He looked at Margaret seriously. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Hale. The risks are considerable, but they're not insurmountable. With proper rest, good nutrition, and careful monitoring, there's no reason you can't carry this baby to term, or close enough to it that survival is likely." "Close enough?" Margaret's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Ideally, we want another 2 months at minimum. 3 would be better, but if labor begins early, we'll do everything possible to ensure both you and the child survive." He turned to Dalton. "She needs to avoid stress. No heavy work, no long periods on her feet. Plenty of rest." "Consider it done," Dalton said immediately. "And Mr. Reeves? She'll need support during the delivery. It's going to be difficult, painful, the kind of thing that's easier to endure when someone you trust is present." Margaret saw Dalton's throat work as he swallowed. "I'll be there, whatever she needs." After the doctor left, with a promise to return in 3 weeks for another examination, Margaret felt the weight of reality settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd known intellectually that childbirth at her age was dangerous, but hearing it stated so baldly by a medical professional made it impossible to ignore. She was sitting by the window in her room when Dalton knocked softly and entered. "You all right?" "No," Margaret admitted. "I'm terrified." He crossed to her, knelt down so they were eye level. "I'm scared too." "You don't show it." "Years of practice. Ranchers aren't supposed to show fear. It spooks the cattle." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "But I'm human, Margaret. The thought of losing you, of something going wrong, it keeps me awake at night." "Then why are you doing this? Why risk everything for someone who might not even survive to—" He pressed a finger gently to her lips, silencing her. "Because the alternative, living without you, going back to the emptiness that was my life before, that's not living at all. It's just existing, and I'm done with just existing." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't deserve you. You deserve better than me, better than this situation, but we work with what we have." He stood, offered his hand. "Come on. Mrs. Chen made dumplings. Doctor's orders are to eat well, and you know she'll have both our hides if we let them get cold." The dumplings were excellent, as always. They ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, which had become their habit. It felt more intimate somehow, sharing the space where food was prepared rather than just consumed. "I organized the last 6 months of receipts today," Margaret said, steering toward safer topics. "Found some interesting discrepancies in what you were charged versus what the contract specified." Dalton looked up sharply. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind that suggests Morrison's has been overcharging you for feed for at least half a year. Probably longer, but I haven't gone back further yet." "How much?" "Roughly $200, near as I can calculate." Dalton's jaw tightened. "That son of a—" He caught himself, glanced at Mrs. Chen. "My apologies." The housekeeper waved a dismissive hand. "I hear worse. You want I should put soap in mouth?" Despite the tension, Margaret laughed. The sound surprised her. When had laughter become so rare that it startled her when it emerged? "So, Morrison's been cheating me blind, then gets righteous when I tell the truth about my personal life." Dalton shook his head. "The hypocrisy is almost impressive." "What will you do about it?" "Depends. Can you document it? Prove it with numbers?" "Give me another week with the books. I'll have everything laid out clearly enough that a child could understand it. Then we'll let his customers know exactly what kind of honest businessman Chet Morrison is." Dalton's expression was grim. "I'm not vindictive by nature, Margaret, but I won't be cheated and then judged by the same man." Over the following days, Margaret buried herself in the ranch accounts. It gave her something to focus on besides the constant awareness of the life growing inside her and the ticking clock toward an uncertain future. The numbers were soothing in their objectivity. They didn't care about scandal or age or propriety. They simply were. She found more discrepancies, not just with Morrison's, but with several other suppliers. Small amounts, mostly, the kind of thing that might go unnoticed if someone wasn't paying close attention. But they added up. Over the course of 2 years, Dalton had been overcharged by nearly $600. "They thought you wouldn't notice," Margaret said, showing him her carefully compiled evidence. "Or that you were too proud to go through the accounts yourself." Dalton studied the ledger, his expression darkening with each page. "Pride's an expensive luxury. Henderson should have caught this." Henderson was either incompetent or complicit. Either way, he's gone now. "And I've got you instead." Dalton looked up from the ledger, something warm in his eyes. "Best trade I've ever made." The comment sent heat to Margaret's cheeks. Even after weeks of living in close quarters, Dalton's casual affection still caught her off guard. She'd spent so many years as an invisible widow that being seen, truly seen, felt like standing in direct sunlight after years in shadow. James visited again the following Sunday, his manner slightly less hostile than before. He nodded to Margaret when he entered, which she counted as progress. "Heard Morrison's is spreading rumors about the ranch being in financial trouble," James said to his father without preamble. "Says you're so desperate you had to hire a woman to do your books because you can't afford a real accountant." Margaret's hand tightened on her teacup, but Dalton just smiled. Interesting timing, considering Margaret just discovered Morrison's has been overcharging us for 2 years, to the tune of about $200. He slid the ledger across the table. "Take a look." James studied the numbers, his eyebrows rising. You're sure about this? The numbers don't lie, Margaret said quietly. Unlike people. James glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. Can you prove it? Every transaction's documented. Dates, amounts, what the contract specified versus what was actually charged. Huh. James sat back, processing. So what are you planning to do? Thought I'd pay Morrison a visit tomorrow. Show him what we've found. Give him a chance to make it right before I take it to his other customers. He'll deny it. Call the numbers false. Let him try. Margaret's work speaks for itself. Dalton's tone carried absolute confidence. James looked between them, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke directly to Margaret. The baby, when's it due? The question caught her off guard. Late February, early March, if all goes well. And if it doesn't? James, Dalton warned. No, it's all right. Margaret met the younger man's gaze steadily. If it doesn't go well, then I'll have died doing something that mattered. Bringing a life into this world. That's more purpose than many people find in a lifetime. And my father? What happens to him if you die? Then he'll grieve, and hopefully, eventually he'll heal. The same way he did when your mother passed. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. I can't promise I'll survive this, James. But I can promise I'm not going into it carelessly. I want to live. I want to meet this baby. Watch them grow. She glanced at Dalton. I want a future I never thought I'd have, so I'm going to fight for it with everything I have. James was quiet for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. All right. All right. He stood, collected his hat. I still think this whole situation is insane, but maybe it's the kind of insane that works out sometimes. After he left, Dalton let out a long breath. That was progress. That was survival instinct. He's realized I'm not leaving, so he's adapting. Margaret set down her teacup with trembling hands. The confrontation, mild as it was, had exhausted her. You should rest, Dalton said, noting her pallor. It's only 3 p.m. Doctor's orders. Rest, Margaret. She wanted to argue, but found she didn't have the energy. The truth was, she was tired all the time now. The baby seemed to be drawing every ounce of strength from her body, leaving her hollow and weak. Dalton helped her upstairs, his hand steady at her elbow. At the door to her room, he paused. What you said to James, about wanting a future, did you mean that? Every word? Even the part about being with me? Margaret looked up at this man who'd turned his entire life upside down for her. Especially that part. He leaned down, pressed a kiss to her forehead. It was chaste, respectful, but it carried the weight of unspoken promises. Sleep well, Margaret. She did. Better than she had in weeks. And if she dreamed of a future that seemed impossible, of babies and belonging and love that didn't bow to judgment, well, no one needed to know but her. The confrontation with Morrison happened on a cold Monday morning. Dalton insisted Margaret stay at the ranch, no sense exposing you to more of his poison than necessary, but she made him promise to tell her everything when he returned. He was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, his expression was grim but satisfied. He denied it at first, Dalton reported, accepting the coffee Mrs. Chen pressed into his hands. Called your numbers false. Said you'd manipulated the books to make him look bad. What did you say? I told him that Margaret Hale had more integrity in her little finger than he had in his entire body. Then I showed him the contracts, his own signatures on documents that proved exactly what he'd been charging versus what we'd agreed to. And? He tried to bluster, said it was honest mistakes, that his clerk must have made errors. I gave him a choice, pay back what he owes with interest, or I take the evidence to every rancher he does business with and let them draw their own conclusions. Margaret leaned forward. What did he choose? Said he'd need a few weeks to come up with the money. I gave him until the end of the month. Dalton's smile was cold. Also told him that his moral outrage about my personal life rang pretty hollow coming from a man who'd been stealing from me for 2 years. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect. A lot of sputtering about how it wasn't the same thing, how business was business but morality was morality. I told him theft was theft, and his particular brand of righteousness didn't impress me much. Mrs. Chen, listening from where she was preparing lunch, made a sound of satisfaction. Good. Man is snake. Everyone know, nobody say. Well, they'll say now, Dalton replied. I stopped by the feed store in Silverton on the way back. They were happy to hear I'd be doing more business with them. Also happy to hear why I was switching suppliers. Margaret felt a twinge of unease. You told them? Didn't have to say much. Just mentioned I'd found some irregularities in Morrison's billing. People can draw their own conclusions. The news spread faster than wildfire. Within 2 days, word came back that 3 other ranchers had started reviewing their own accounts with Morrison's and weren't liking what they found. By the end of the week, Morrison's feed and supply had lost half its customer base. The town's attitude toward Dalton began to shift. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Red Hollow still whispered about the scandal, still judged him for standing by Margaret. But there was a new wariness in how people treated him. A recognition that Dalton Reeves wasn't a man who could be bullied into submission through social pressure. For Margaret, the isolation continued. She rarely left the ranch now, partly because of doctor's orders and partly because she had no desire to face the stares and whispers. The ranch became her entire world. The house with its comfortable rooms, the ground she could see from the windows, the people within its borders who treated her like a human being rather than a scandal. December arrived with the first serious snow. Margaret watched it fall from the window of Dalton's study, where she'd been working on year-end accounts. The baby had been especially active today, rolling and kicking with an energy that both delighted and worried her. You're restless, she murmured, rubbing the tight swell of her belly. I don't blame you. I'm getting pretty tired of waiting too. Talking to yourself? Dalton's voice came from the doorway. That's a bad sign. Talking to the baby. That's perfectly normal. He crossed to her, stood behind her chair with his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. Together they watched the snow accumulate on the windowsill, turning the world white and pristine. 3 more months, Dalton said quietly. Maybe less, if the baby decides to come early. Are you ready? Not even close. You? Terrified, Margaret admitted, but also excited? Is that strange, to be excited about something that might kill me? It's human. His hand squeezed gently. What does the baby feel like when it moves? Margaret caught one of his hands, brought it around to press against her belly. They stood like that for a long moment, waiting. Then the baby kicked, a solid thump against Dalton's palm. She felt him stiffen with surprise. That was your daughter, or son, saying hello. Another kick, stronger this time. Dalton's breath caught. When Margaret glanced back at him, his expression was one of wonder, mixed with fear, mixed with something that looked like love. I felt James kick like this, he said softly. 26 years ago, with Sarah. She'd put my hand on her belly, and we'd wait for him to move. His voice grew thick with memory. I'd forgotten what it felt like, the miracle of it. The baby kicked again, and Margaret felt Dalton's arms come around her, careful of her swollen middle, but firm and secure. They stood like that as the snow continued to fall, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds, waiting for a future that neither of them had planned but both desperately wanted. Thank you, Dalton whispered against her hair. For what? For being brave enough to stay, for giving me a reason to fight for something besides land and cattle. His voice broke slightly. For making me feel alive again. Margaret turned in his arms as much as her bulk would allow, looked up into his weathered face. I love you, Dalton Reeves. I probably shouldn't. It's too fast, too complicated, too everything, but I do. I love you too, Margaret Hale. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. And you're right, it is too fast, too complicated, too everything. But it's also the best thing that's happened to me in years. He kissed her then, properly this time. Not the chaste forehead kiss of before, but a real kiss that carried months of longing and fear and hope. Margaret kissed him back, letting herself fall into the moment, into the impossible beauty of being wanted at 52 when she'd thought that part of her life was over. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. Margaret's heart stuttered. What? Marry me, Not because we have to, not to stop gossip or make things proper, but because I want to. Because I want to stand up in front of whatever witnesses we can find and declare that you're mine and I'm yours, and everyone else can go to hell. Dalton, I know it won't stop the judgment. I know Red Hollow will still whisper, but I want you to have my name, Margaret. I want this baby to have my name legally, not just by acknowledgement. I want... He pulled back slightly to look at her. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're my wife. Say yes. Margaret's eyes stung with tears. It was everything she hadn't dared to hope for. Yes, she whispered. Yes, of course, yes. This time, when he kissed her, there was joy in it, pure, uncomplicated joy. They were married 2 weeks later in the ranch house parlor with James and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. The minister was a traveling preacher who asked no questions and offered no judgment, just performed the ceremony with quiet efficiency. Margaret wore a dress Mrs. Chen had somehow produced, soft gray wool that accommodated her belly without making her look like a tent. Dalton wore his best suit and looked so handsome it made her heart ache. Do you, Dalton Thomas Reeves, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. And do you, Margaret Elizabeth Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The kiss was brief, appropriate for the witnesses present, but it carried the weight of promises made and kept. Afterward, Mrs. Chen produced a cake she'd baked in secret and champagne that Dalton had been saving for a special occasion. They toasted in the parlor while snow fell outside, creating the kind of scene that belonged in a story rather than real life. James pulled Margaret aside while Dalton was talking with the minister about payment. I was wrong about you, he said without preamble. You're not here for his money. You're not trying to trap him. You're just a woman who fell in love with my father, and he fell in love with you. It's strange as hell, but it's real. Thank you for saying that. Don't thank me yet. I'm still not sure about this whole thing, but... He glanced at Dalton, then back to her. But I'm willing to try. For his sake. And for that baby's sake. They deserve a family, not a battlefield. We all deserve that, Margaret said softly. After the guests left, Margaret and Dalton stood together in the quiet house, husband and wife now, legally, officially, irrevocably bound. How do you feel? Dalton asked. Like I'm living someone else's life, someone lucky. You are lucky. You got stuck with me. He was teasing, but there was vulnerability beneath it. Margaret took his hand, pressed it to her belly, where the baby was doing acrobatics. We both got lucky. Against all odds, we found each other. We survived the worst Red Hollow could throw at us. And now we're here, married, with a baby on the way. If that's not luck, I don't know what is. Dalton pulled her close, careful of her belly, and held her like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. I won't let anything happen to you, he whispered fiercely. When the baby comes, when things get hard, I'll be right there. You won't face it alone. I know, Margaret said, and she did. Whatever happened next, whether the birth went smoothly or became the nightmare they both feared, they would face it together. That night, for the first time, Margaret slept in Dalton's room. Not out of obligation or expectation, but because they were married now and neither of them wanted to spend the night apart. She fell asleep wrapped in his arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and dreamed of futures that might actually come true. The marriage changed things in ways both subtle and profound. Margaret no longer felt like a guest in the ranch house, but rather its mistress, a role that settled over her shoulders with surprising comfort. She found herself making small decisions without asking permission, rearranging furniture in the parlor, instructing Mrs. Chen about meal preferences, organizing the household accounts with the same efficiency she'd brought to the ranch ledgers. Dalton seemed to thrive on the domesticity. Margaret would catch him watching her sometimes with an expression of contentment that made her chest tight. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, Margaret with her sewing and Dalton with his books, existing in companionable silence that felt more intimate than any words. But beneath the peaceful surface, tension was building. Margaret could feel it in her body. The increasing discomfort, the baby's movements growing more insistent, the tightening sensations that came and went with alarming frequency. False labor, Dr. Brennan said during his examination in early January. He'd taken to visiting weekly now, monitoring Margaret's condition with increasing concern. Your body's preparing, but it's too soon. You need to stay off your feet as much as possible. I can't just lie in bed all day, Margaret protested. You can, and you will. The doctor's tone brooked no argument. Mrs. Reeves, I'm not trying to make your life difficult, but if you want any chance of carrying this baby to term, you need complete bed rest. No stairs, no heavy work, nothing that requires significant exertion. Dalton, who'd been hovering near the door, stepped forward. She'll do exactly as you say, doctor. I'm right here, Margaret said irritably. You can talk to me directly. Then I'm talking to you. Dalton's expression was gentle but firm. You're staying in bed, Margaret. We'll bring meals up, set up the study work here if you need something to occupy your mind. But no more stairs, no more pretending you're fine when you're not. Margaret wanted to argue, but another contraction, stronger than the previous ones, chose that moment to grip her belly. She gasped, pressing a hand to the taut swell, and both men moved toward her with alarm. How long have those been happening? Dr. Brennan demanded. Off and on for a few days. They're not regular. That doesn't matter. Any contractions at this stage are concerning. He helped her lie back against the pillows, his face grave. I'm going to be frank with you both. The baby's position to come early could be tomorrow, could be a month from now. But when labor starts in earnest, it's going to progress fast. You need to be prepared. What do we need? Dalton asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Doctor. Brennan rattled off a list. Clean linens, hot water, certain medical supplies he'd leave behind, a plan for getting word to him quickly when the time came. Margaret listened with growing dread, the clinical details making the danger feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. After the doctor left, Dalton sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. I'm scared, Margaret admitted. Me too. He brought her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. But we're going to get through this, both of you. You can't promise that. Watch me. The forced bed rest was torture. Margaret had never been good at sitting still, and being confined to one room while life continued around her felt like a special kind of punishment. She tried to work on the accounts from bed, but the numbers swam before her eyes. She attempted reading, but couldn't focus. Mostly she just lay there, feeling the baby move inside her, and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Mrs. Chen visited regularly, bringing meals and gossip from town that she'd heard from suppliers. Apparently word of the marriage had spread, causing a fresh wave of scandal. People say you trap him, Mrs. Chen reported matter-of-factly. Say you use baby to force marriage. I tell them they are fools. Boss never do anything you not want to do. What else are they saying? The housekeeper hesitated, clearly debating whether to share. Finally, she sighed. Some say you practice witchcraft, that no woman your age get pregnant natural, so must be dark magic. Margaret laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. Witchcraft, of course, because biology is too mundane an explanation. People fear what they don't understand. They make up stories to explain. Mrs. Chen set down the lunch tray, fixed Margaret with a serious look. Baby coming soon. Maybe week, maybe less. You feel it too, yes? Margaret nodded slowly. She did feel it. A heaviness. A sense of things shifting and preparing. How can you tell? Your face different. Your body different. I see many births. I know signs. The housekeeper patted her hand. We be ready. Don't worry. But worry was all Margaret could do, lying in bed hour after hour with nothing but her thoughts for company. She worried about the baby coming too early. She worried about dying in childbirth and leaving Dalton alone again. She worried about surviving but losing the baby. She worried about everything surviving but Red Hollow never accepting them. The worries spiraled until Dalton came home each evening, climbed the stairs despite being exhausted from ranch work, and sat with her while she ate dinner. He'd tell her about his day, which cattle were being stubborn, what James had reported from the North Pasture, how the new feed supplier was working out, normal things that anchored her to reality. I'm sorry I'm so useless, Margaret said one evening, pushing food around her plate without eating. You're growing a human being. That's the opposite of useless. I should be helping with the ranch work, with the accounts. The accounts are fine, the ranch is fine. What's not fine is you not eating. He speared a piece of chicken, held it to her lips. Come on. You heard the doctor. The baby needs you strong. Margaret ate to please him, though her appetite had vanished weeks ago. The baby pressed on her stomach constantly now, leaving little room for food. But she forced it down, knowing Dalton was right even if she didn't feel like admitting it. That night, January 14th, Margaret woke to a sensation she'd never experienced before. Not pain exactly, but pressure. Intense, overwhelming pressure low in her belly. She lay still for a moment, breathing carefully, telling herself it was another false alarm. Then her water broke. The warm gush of fluid soaked through her nightgown and the sheets, unmistakable and terrifying. Margaret's breath caught. "Dalton," she said, her voice tight. Then louder, "Dalton!" He was awake instantly, the way ranchers learn to wake, fully alert, ready for crisis. "What's wrong?" "The baby. It's coming." For a moment, Dalton didn't move, as if his mind was struggling to process what she'd said. Then he was in motion, lighting the bedside lamp, helping her sit up, his face pale but determined. "It's too soon," Margaret whispered. "It's too soon. It's only 7.5 months. The doctor said 7 months was survivable. We're past that." Dalton's voice was steady, but she could hear the fear underneath. "I'm getting Mrs. Chen. Don't move." He was gone and back within minutes, the housekeeper trailing behind him in her nightdress with her hair in a long braid down her back. She took one look at the wet sheets and nodded. "Baby coming now. We prepare." She turned to Dalton. "You send Charlie for doctor, fast as he can ride. Then you come back here. She need you." "But—" "No buts. You be here. This your wife, your baby. You be here, or I lock you out of house forever." Despite everything, Margaret felt a hysterical laugh bubble up. Mrs. Chen's threats were creative even in crisis. Charlie was dispatched into the dark winter night. Mrs. Chen and Dalton worked together to change the sheets, get Margaret into a clean nightgown, prepare the room according to the doctor's instructions. Margaret endured it all in a daze, the contractions still irregular but increasing in intensity. "How bad is the pain?" Mrs. Chen asked, pressing a cool cloth to Margaret's forehead. "Manageable, for now. It get worse, much worse, but you strong. You survive." The certainty in the housekeeper's voice was oddly comforting. Mrs. Chen had delivered babies before, had seen women through this ordeal. She knew what was coming, knew it was survivable. The contractions intensified over the next hour. Margaret tried to breathe through them the way Mrs. Chen instructed, but each one stole her breath, left her gasping and trembling. Dalton held her hand through it all, his grip firm enough to ground her without causing pain. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "Just fine, Margaret. I'm scared." "I know, me too. But we're in this together, remember?" Another contraction hit, stronger than before, and Margaret cried out despite her efforts to stay quiet. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined. Not sharp, but deep, primal, consuming. It felt like her body was trying to tear itself apart. "That one was close to the last," Mrs. Chen observed, timing with the clock. "Maybe 5 minutes between. Going faster now." Where was the doctor? Margaret wanted to ask, but couldn't form words around the pain. It had been at least an hour since Charlie left. How long did it take to ride to town and back? Too long, clearly. Far too long. "I need to push," Margaret gasped as another contraction peaked. "Not yet," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Not until doctor come or baby crowning. Too early to push, could cause tearing." "I don't care about tearing. I need No pushing." The housekeeper's voice was steel. "You breathe. In, out, in, out. No pushing until I say." It was torture, fighting against her body's overwhelming urge to bear down. Margaret gripped Dalton's hand so hard she thought she might break his fingers, but he didn't complain. He just stayed there, solid and present, whispering encouragement that she barely heard over the roaring in her ears. Time became meaningless. There were only contractions and the brief respites between them. Margaret existed in a world narrowed to pain and survival. All thoughts of scandal and judgment and fear burned away by the immediate crisis of bringing life into the world. She was barely aware of new voices in the room, Dr. Brennan arriving windblown and urgent, issuing rapid instructions to Mrs. Chen, examining Margaret with practiced efficiency. "She's fully dilated," he announced. "The baby's coming whether we're ready or not. Mrs. Chen, I need those towels. Mr. Reeves, stay at her head, support her back when she pushes." "I'm not leaving," Dalton said, his voice rough. "Good. She'll need you." The doctor positioned himself at the foot of the bed. "All right, Margaret. Next contraction, I want you to push. Give it everything you have." The next contraction built like a wave, cresting higher and higher until Margaret thought she'd drown in it. Then Dr. Brennan's voice. "Now, push!" She bore down with every ounce of strength, feeling something shift inside her, something moving. The pressure was enormous, impossible, but also somehow right. This was what her body was meant to do. "Good. Again, when the next one comes." Dalton supported her back, his arms strong around her. She could hear him talking but couldn't make out the words. All her focus was on the task at hand, pushing, breathing, surviving. "I can see the head," Dr. Brennan said, excitement creeping into his professional tone. "One more push, maybe two. You're almost there, Margaret." The next contraction came fast on the heels of the last. Margaret pushed with desperate strength, feeling something give way, feeling a baby's cry split the air, thin, reedy, but unmistakably alive. "It's a girl," Dr. Brennan announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A perfect little girl." Margaret collapsed back against Dalton, tears streaming down her face. A girl. They had a daughter. "Is she—" Margaret couldn't finish the question. "Is she all right? Is she breathing? Is she going to survive?" "She's small," the doctor said, working quickly to clear the baby's airway, tie off the cord. "Very small, but her lungs are strong. You can hear that. And her color's good." Mrs. Chen appeared with warmed blankets, helped wrap the tiny infant. Then finally, they placed her in Margaret's arms. She was impossibly small, probably no more than 4 pounds. Her face was red and wrinkled, her eyes squeezed shut against the harsh lamplight. Dark hair plastered to her skull, tiny fists waving in agitation. She was perfect. "Hello, little one," Margaret whispered, touching one finger to a miniature hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around it immediately, gripped surprisingly strong for something so small. "Hello, sweetheart. We've been waiting for you." Dalton leaned over, his face wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "She's beautiful," he said roughly. "She's perfect, Margaret." "Small but fierce," Mrs. Chen observed, hovering nearby with more blankets. "Good lungs. That very good sign." Dr. Brennan was still working, delivering the afterbirth, checking for complications. "You're bleeding more than I'd like," he said quietly to Margaret. "But it's manageable. I'm going to need to stitch you up. You tore during delivery. But overall, Mrs. Reeves, you did remarkably well. Both of you did." The stitching was painful, but Margaret barely noticed. She couldn't take her eyes off her daughter. This tiny, impossible miracle who shouldn't exist but did. Who'd come early and small, but alive. "What will you name her?" Dr. Brennan asked as he worked. Margaret looked at Dalton, who looked back at her. They discussed names during the quiet evenings, but suddenly, none of them seemed quite right. "Sarah," Dalton said softly. "After my first wife. If you don't mind, Margaret, she'd have wanted her name to live on." Margaret thought about Sarah Reeves, who'd died bringing James into the world, who'd never gotten to watch her son grow up, who'd loved this man when he was young and less weathered by time. "Sarah Margaret Reeves," Margaret said, "after both the women who loved you." Dalton's expression crumpled. He pressed his face to Margaret's hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She held their daughter with one arm and reached up to hold him with the other, the three of them creating a tableau of survival and love and impossible joy. Dr. Brennan finished his work and stepped back. "I'm going to stay for a few hours, monitor both of them. But I think the worst is past. The baby needs to stay warm, needs to nurse frequently. Her size is concerning, but if she makes it through the next few days, her chances improve dramatically." "She'll make it," Dalton said, lifting his head. His face was blotchy with tears, but his voice carried absolute conviction. "She's a fighter, just like her mother." The hours that followed blurred together. The baby, Sarah, nursed with surprising vigor despite her size, latching on with determined strength. Margaret was exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced, but every time she looked at her daughter, energy seemed to flow back into her depleted body. Mrs. Chen bustled in and out, bringing food for Margaret, tea for everyone, keeping the fire built up so the room stayed warm enough for the fragile infant. Dr. Brennan dozed in a chair, ready to respond if complications arose. And Dalton stayed, refusing to leave even when Mrs. Chen suggested he get some sleep. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, positioned on the edge of the bed where he could watch both Margaret and Sarah. "I missed too much of James's first hours. I won't miss these." Dawn broke cold and clear. Through the window, Margaret could see the first light painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. A new day. A new beginning. James arrived mid-morning, having been summoned by Charlie. He stood in the doorway looking uncertain, younger than his 26 years. "Come in," Dalton said quietly. "Come meet your sister." James approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Margaret's arms. "She's so small. Early babies usually are, but she's strong." Margaret shifted so he could see Sarah's face. The baby was sleeping now, her features relaxed, impossibly perfect. "Can I—" James hesitated. "Can I hold her?" "Sit down first," Margaret instructed. "Support her head." James sat in the chair by the bed, and Margaret carefully transferred the baby into his arms. He held her awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence, his expression transforming as he looked down at his half-sister. "Hey there, little bit," he murmured. "I'm your big brother. I know that's weird. I'm old enough to be your dad, basically, but I promise I'll look out for you. Won't let anything bad happen to you." Sarah stirred at the sound of his voice, made a tiny mewling sound. James looked up in alarm. "You're fine," Dalton assured him. "She's just letting you know she's there." "I'm sorry," James said abruptly, looking at Margaret, "for how I acted when this all started, for judging you, for making everything harder. You didn't deserve that. You were protecting your father, I understand. No, I was being selfish, scared of change, scared of losing what I knew." He looked back down at Sarah. "But this, she's family. And your family now, too. I should have seen that sooner." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. She seemed to be doing nothing but crying lately. "Thank you, James." He stayed for another hour, holding Sarah with increasing ease, asking questions about the delivery with the kind of morbid curiosity only family could get away with. When he finally left, promising to return the next day, the room felt somehow more complete, as if a missing piece had finally clicked into place. Dr. Brennan examined both Margaret and Sarah one more time before preparing to leave. "The bleeding stopped, which is excellent. Your color's better. The baby's maintaining her body temperature and nursing well. All very good signs." He packed his instruments methodically. "But I'll be back tomorrow to check on you both. And Mrs. Reeves? No getting out of bed for at least a week. Your body's been through severe trauma. It needs time to heal." "I'll make sure she follows orders," Dalton said. "See that you do. And Mr. Reeves, you did well today. Most men can't handle being present for a difficult birth. You stayed calm, stayed helpful. Your wife was lucky to have you there." After the doctor left, the house settled into quiet. Mrs. Chen brought lunch, which Margaret ate ravenously. Apparently surviving childbirth gave you an appetite. Sarah slept in a cradle that Dalton had retrieved from somewhere in the house, probably the same one James had used as an infant. Dalton lay down beside Margaret on the bed, careful not to jostle her, and they watched their daughter sleep. "We did it," Margaret whispered. "We actually did it. You did it. I just held your hand. You did more than that. You were there. You didn't look away, didn't leave, didn't falter. You were exactly what I needed." Dalton turned on his side so he was facing her. "I love you, Margaret Reeves. I loved you before today, but now I love you in a way I didn't know was possible. You're the strongest person I've ever known." "I'm not strong. I'm terrified. She's so small, Dalton. What if something happens? What if—" "Then we'll face it. Together. But she's going to be fine. Look at her. Those are fighter's lungs in that tiny body. She came into this world early, but she came in fighting. She gets that from you." Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the worst was behind them, that Sarah would grow strong and healthy, that their family would thrive despite the odds. The baby stirred in her cradle, made a small sound. Without thinking, both Margaret and Dalton turned toward her, ready to respond to whatever she needed. "We're parents," Margaret said wonderingly. "Together, an actual family." "The scandal of Red Hollow," Dalton agreed, a hint of humor in his voice. "The too old widow and the rancher who should have known better. And our impossible daughter who refused to wait for anyone's approval to be born." Sarah chose that moment to wake fully, her face scrunching up in preparation for a cry. Margaret reached for her, brought her to breast, felt the tiny mouth latch on with that same determined strength. "She knows what she wants," Dalton observed, "just like her father." They sat like that as afternoon light slanted through the window, painting everything in gold. Outside, the world continued its judgment and gossip. But inside this room, there was only love and wonder and the fragile, fierce hope that came with new life. Sarah finished nursing and fell back asleep in Margaret's arms. Dalton carefully took her, held her against his chest with surprising gentleness for such a large man. He walked to the window, showed her the snow-covered landscape, even though her eyes were still closed. "That's your home out there," he murmured. "All that land as far as you can see. Someday you'll ride across it, learn every hill and valley. You'll be strong like your mother, determined like both of us, I suppose." He pressed a kiss to her tiny forehead. "And you'll never, ever doubt that you were wanted, loved, worth every moment of trouble you caused getting here." Margaret watched them, her husband and daughter silhouetted against the winter light, and felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe. Or acceptance. Or simply the knowledge that whatever came next, whatever hardships or joys the future held, they would face it as a family. Red Hollow could whisper all it wanted. This was real. This was theirs. And nothing could take that away. The first week of Sarah's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and anxious monitoring. Dr. Brennan visited daily, watching the baby's weight with the intensity of a hawk tracking prey. She'd been born at 4 pounds, 2 ounces, dangerously small even for a premature infant. Each ounce she gained felt like a victory against impossible odds. Margaret barely left the bed, following doctor's orders with uncharacteristic obedience. The birth had taken more from her than she'd expected. Her body ached in ways she'd never experienced, and exhaustion weighed on her like a physical thing. But every time Sarah cried, every time those tiny lungs demanded attention, Margaret found reserves of strength she didn't know existed. Dalton proved himself an unexpectedly capable partner in those early days. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with a fussy Sarah at 3 a.m, brought Margaret meals when she was too tired to remember to eat. He'd transformed from the formidable rancher who commanded respect through force of will into something softer, a father completely undone by 7 pounds of infant determination. "She gained another ounce," Dr. Brennan announced during his examination on day 8, unable to hide his smile. 4 pounds, 10 ounces now. That's excellent progress." Margaret, who'd been holding her breath, finally released it. "She's going to be all right? If she keeps gaining at this rate, I'd say her chances are very good. The first 2 weeks are the most critical for premature infants. We're past the first, and she's thriving." He packed his instruments with satisfaction. "You've done well, Mrs. Reeves, both of you." After he left, Margaret allowed herself to cry. Not from fear this time, but from relief so profound it hurt. Dalton held her while she sobbed, one arm around his wife, the other cradling their daughter. "I told you she was a fighter," he murmured against Margaret's hair. "You did. I should have believed you sooner. You can believe me now." Word of Sarah's birth had spread through Red Hollow within hours, as news always did in small towns. The response was complicated. Some people sent gifts, awkward peace offerings that arrived via sheepish delivery boys. A handmade quilt from Sarah Jensen, the woman with 3 stair-step children. A wooden rattle carved by old Mr. Henderson, who'd been Dalton's previous bookkeeper. Even a basket of preserves from someone who didn't include a name, as if ashamed to be caught being kind. But others doubled down on their judgment. Constance Fletcher reportedly declared the baby's premature birth as proof of wrongdoing, though she seemed fuzzy on exactly what that proved. The church elders remained pointedly silent on the matter, and Chet Morrison, still smarting from his exposure as a cheat, spread rumors that the baby wasn't actually premature at all, that Margaret had been pregnant long before the blizzard, making Dalton a fool taken in by a scheming woman. "Let them talk," Dalton said when word of Morrison's latest slander reached the ranch. "In 6 months, when Sarah's healthy and happy, the truth will be obvious to anyone with eyes." Margaret wished she had his confidence. She'd spent so many years measuring her worth by others' opinions that shedding that habit felt impossible. But every time she looked at Sarah, at this tiny miracle who'd defied every expectation to exist, the town's judgment seemed to matter a little less. By the end of January, Margaret was finally allowed out of bed. Her first trip downstairs felt momentous, like reclaiming territory that had been occupied by invaders. Mrs. Chen had kept the house running with ruthless efficiency, but there were small things Margaret wanted to change, personal touches that would make this space truly hers. She was rearranging books in the parlor when James arrived, stomping snow from his boots in the entryway. "How's the little one?" he asked, his ritual greeting now. "Growing, sleeping, eating everything in sight." Margaret straightened, pressing a hand to her still tender abdomen. "Your father's upstairs with her now. She's got him completely wrapped around her tiny finger." James grinned. "Never thought I'd see the day Dalton Reeves got reduced to baby talk, but here we are." He removed his coat, hung it carefully. "I actually came to talk to you. Got something to show you." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, smoothed it out on the side table. It was a letter, Margaret saw, written in neat script. "It's from the Cattlemen's Association," James explained. "They're hosting a spring gathering in March. All the major ranchers from 3 counties. Business meetings, contract negotiations, that sort of thing. Dad's been a member for 20 years, never missed one." Margaret scanned the letter, saw the date and location. "That's 2 months away. Why are you showing me this now?" "Because the letter specifically states that wives are invited to the social events. There's going to be a dinner, a dance. It's a big deal. All the important families will be there." James met her eyes steadily. "If Dad shows up with you, it's a statement. It tells everyone that the Reeves family isn't hiding, isn't ashamed, that you're his wife in every sense, not some secret he keeps on the ranch." Margaret's stomach clenched. "And if he shows up with me, he'll face judgment from every powerful rancher in the territory." "Maybe. Or maybe some of them will surprise you. Maybe they'll see what I see, that you make him happy in a way he hasn't been in years. That Sarah is family, legitimate, and loved. That none of the scandal matters compared to the reality of what you've built together." "You've changed your tune." James had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was an ass when this started. Scared of change, protective of what I knew. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you handle motherhood at an age when most women are grandmothers, seeing how you love Dad and Sarah without reservation, it's humbling. You're braver than I'll ever be." Margaret felt tears threaten again. She seemed to cry at everything these days. "Thank you for saying that. I mean it, and I think you should go to that gathering, stand beside Dad and show Red Hollow, show the whole territory, that you're not going anywhere." When Dalton came downstairs later, Margaret showed him the letter. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. "We don't have to go," he said finally. "If you're not ready, if it's too much, I want to go." He looked up sharply. "Margaret, I'm tired of hiding. Tired of letting other people's judgment control our lives. You stood up for me when I was alone and terrified. The least I can do is stand beside you now." She took his hand, laced their fingers together. "Besides, I want to show off our daughter. Let all those proper wives see what love looks like when it doesn't ask permission first." Dalton's answering smile was fierce and proud. "Then we'll go. And we'll make an entrance they'll talk about for years." The weeks leading up to the gathering became a flurry of preparation. Margaret hadn't owned a proper dress in years, certainly nothing suitable for a formal cattleman's dinner. Mrs. Chen solved this problem by producing a catalog from a Denver dressmaker and insisting they order something worthy of the occasion. "You are wife of Dalton Reeves now," the housekeeper declared. "You dress like it. No more widow clothes. You wear color, show you alive." The dress that arrived in mid-February was beautiful, deep emerald green silk that brought out the color in Margaret's eyes, with delicate beadwork on the bodice and a cut that accommodated her post-pregnancy figure without making her look matronly. When she tried it on for the first time, Dalton actually stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. "You're stunning," he said roughly. Margaret examined herself in the mirror with uncertainty. She hadn't felt beautiful in so long that seeing it reflected back was disorienting. Her face was thinner than before the pregnancy, aged by stress and sleepless nights. But there was also something new there, a strength that hadn't existed before, a confidence born of survival. "I look like someone's wife," she said wonderingly. "You look like my wife. There's a difference." Sarah chose that moment to wail from her cradle, and the tender moment dissolved into the practical chaos of infant care. But Margaret caught Dalton watching her throughout the evening with an expression that made her feel beautiful, regardless of what any mirror showed. The baby continued to thrive, gaining weight steadily until Dr. Brennan declared her out of danger. By early March, she weighed nearly 7 pounds. Still small for her age, but within the range of normal. Her eyes had opened fully, revealing the same gray-blue that Dalton's held. She tracked movement now, would even offer tiny smiles that might have been gas but felt like benedictions. "She knows us," Margaret said one evening, watching Sarah's eyes follow Dalton across the room. "Look how she watches you." Smart girl. Knows who's most likely to give her whatever she wants. Dalton scooped up his daughter with easy practice, held her against his shoulder. "Isn't that right, little one? You've got your old man figured out already." Sarah made a contented gurgling sound, one tiny fist tangling in Dalton's collar. James, who'd become a regular visitor, laughed from his position by the fire. "You're in trouble when she gets older. She's going to have you buying her ponies and dresses and whatever else she bats those eyes for." "Worth it," Dalton said without hesitation. The day of the cattlemen's gathering arrived cold but clear. They'd arranged for Mrs. Chen to stay with Sarah. The baby was too young for such a journey, and Margaret's maternal instincts screamed at leaving her. But the housekeeper was experienced and trustworthy, and it was only one night. "She'll be fine," Mrs. Chen assured Margaret for the 10th time. "You go. Show those people who you are. Baby and I have grand time without you." The drive to Silverton, where the gathering was being held, took most of the day. Margaret sat beside Dalton in the wagon, wrapped in furs against the cold, watching the landscape change as they descended from the higher elevations. She was nervous in a way she hadn't been since the town hall confrontation. That same tight feeling in her chest, the certainty that she was walking into judgment. "Second thoughts?" Dalton asked, reading her expression. "1,000 of them. But I'm not turning back." "That's my girl." They arrived at the Grand Hotel in Silverton as the sun was setting. It was the finest establishment for 100 miles. 3 stories of Victorian elegance that seemed wildly out of place against the rough mountain landscape. Inside, the lobby was already filling with ranchers and their wives, everyone dressed in their best. Margaret felt the attention the moment they entered. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they changed tenor. Eyes tracked their movement across the lobby. She heard her name whispered, saw recognition dawn on faces that had clearly heard the story. Dalton must have felt her hesitation because his hand found the small of her back, steady and sure. "Head up," he murmured. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." They registered at the front desk, Mr. and Mrs. Dalton Reeves, one room, and Margaret saw the clerk's eyebrows rise slightly before he schooled his expression to professional neutrality. Their room was on the 2nd floor, spacious and well-appointed. After the rustic comfort of the ranch, it felt almost decadent. But Margaret barely noticed the furnishings. She was too focused on the evening ahead, on walking into a room full of people who judged her without knowing her. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted as she changed into the green dress. Dalton, already dressed in his formal suit, came to stand behind her. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and grounding. "Yes, you can. Because you're Margaret Reeves, and you've survived things that would break most people. A room full of gossiping ranchers is nothing compared to what you've already endured." She met his eyes in the mirror. "What if they're cruel? What if they insult you because of me? Then I'll defend you, same as I've been doing. Margaret, I chose you. Publicly, deliberately, without reservation. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." His certainty bolstered her own wavering confidence. She finished dressing, pinned up her hair, and examined the result. The woman in the mirror looked elegant, composed, nothing like the terrified widow who'd stood before the town council 4 months ago. The dinner was held in the hotel's grand ballroom, a space that had been decorated with remarkable care. Round tables filled the room, each set with fine china and crystal. A small orchestra played in the corner. It was civilization carved out of wilderness, refinement imposed on rough country. Dalton led her in with his hand at her elbow, and Margaret felt every eye in the room turned toward them. She forced herself to keep her expression serene, to walk with confidence she didn't entirely feel. They were seated at a table with 3 other couples. Ranchers Dalton knew from business dealings and their wives. The introductions were polite but cool, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious topic while it hung over the table like smoke. Margaret made it through the first course with quiet dignity, answering questions about the ranch when asked, offering nothing more than necessary. Across the table, a woman named Helena Cartwright studied her with barely concealed fascination. "So, Mrs. Reeves," Helena finally said, her tone light but pointed, "I understand congratulations are in order? You've recently had a baby?" The table went silent. Everyone knew this was the moment, the opening salvo that would determine how the rest of the evening progressed. "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "A daughter, Sarah. She was born in January." "How lovely, and so surprising given—" Helena trailed off delicately. "Given my age?" Margaret finished for her. "Yes, it was quite unexpected. But nature doesn't always follow our expectations, does it?" Helena's smile was sharp. "Indeed not. Though some might say there are certain proprieties that should be observed regardless of what nature allows." Dalton's hand tightened on his fork, but Margaret touched his knee under the table, a silent request to let her handle this. "I'm sure some people do say that," Margaret agreed pleasantly. "Just as some people said women shouldn't own property, or vote in local elections, or do any number of things that we now accept as perfectly reasonable. Social conventions change, Mrs. Cartwright. But love, real love, the kind that weathers judgment and scandal, that's timeless." Helena opened her mouth, clearly prepared to continue the attack, but her husband, a portly man named Douglas, cleared his throat. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about those accounting irregularities you uncovered with Morrison's operation," he said to Margaret, deliberately changing the subject. "Word is you documented systematic overcharging across multiple accounts. That true?" Margaret blinked, surprised by the shift. "Yes. Over the course of 2 years, we found approximately $600 in discrepancies between contracted prices and actual charges." "Documented how?" "Cross-reference purchase orders with delivery receipts and invoices. The pattern was consistent enough to rule out simple clerical error." Douglas leaned forward with genuine interest. "You have experience with bookkeeping?" "I kept my late husband's accounts for 20 years. When I came to the Reeves Ranch, I applied the same methods to their records." "Huh." Douglas glanced at his wife, then back to Margaret. "Helena, remember those questions we had about our hay supplier? The numbers that never quite seemed to add up?" Helena's expression had shifted from hostile to speculative. "You think they might be doing what Morrison did?" "Wouldn't hurt to check. Mrs. Reeves, would you be willing to look at our accounts? I'd pay, of course, professional consultation." Margaret felt Dalton's surprise matching her own. Yes, I suppose I could do that." "Excellent. I'll have the ledger sent over once we're back home." Douglas raised his wine glass. "To honest accounting and the people who practice it." The toast was echoed around the table, and just like that, the tension broke. Conversation resumed, this time focused on business matters rather than scandal. Helena even unbent enough to ask about Sarah's development, sharing stories of her own children's infancy with something approaching warmth. By the time dessert arrived, Margaret felt the tightness in her chest beginning to ease. Not everyone here was an enemy. Some people were practical enough to care more about competence than convention. After dinner, the dancing began. Dalton led Margaret onto the floor with the same confidence he brought to everything, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. She'd forgotten how to dance. It had been decades since she'd had occasion, but her body remembered the basic steps. You're doing beautifully, Dalton murmured as they turned. I'm terrified I'll step on your feet. Wouldn't be the worst thing that's happened to me. He pulled her slightly closer, proprietary and proud. See those people watching us? Half of them are jealous. The other half are reconsidering their judgments. Margaret glanced around and realized he was right. The stares weren't all hostile. Some held curiosity, others grudging respect. A few women were watching with something that looked like envy, not of her specifically, but of what she represented. The possibility of second chances, of love that didn't conform to expectations. As the evening wore on, several other ranchers approached Dalton about business matters, and all of them included Margaret in the conversations with varying degrees of courtesy. Word of her accounting skills had apparently spread because 3 more people asked about consultations before the night ended. You're going to have more work than you can handle, Dalton observed as they finally retreated to their room, both exhausted but satisfied. I don't mind. It feels good to be valued for something other than scandal. Margaret sank onto the bed, began removing her jewelry. Thank you for bringing me tonight, for making me face this. Thank you for being brave enough to stand beside me. Dalton knelt to help her with her shoes, an unexpectedly tender gesture. I know it wasn't easy. Nothing about this has been easy, but it's been worth it. Every difficult moment, every judgment, every fear, all worth it for what we have now. He looked up at her, his weathered face soft with emotion. I love you, Margaret Reeves, more than I thought I could love anyone again. I love you too, even when you're bossy and overprotective and refuse to let me lift anything heavier than a teacup. Someone has to take care of you. You certainly won't do it yourself. They undressed and climbed into bed, and for the first time since Sarah's birth, they made love, carefully, gently, relearning each other's bodies with patience and wonder. It wasn't desperate or passionate so much as affirming, a physical expression of the bond that had formed between them through shared trials. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Dalton's arm around her, Margaret felt something she'd stopped believing was possible. Contentment. Not the absence of problems. They still had those in abundance. Red Hollow still whispered. The ranch still faced challenges. Sarah was still small and fragile despite her progress. But here, in this moment, Margaret was exactly where she belonged. They returned to the ranch the next afternoon to find Mrs. Chen looking smug and Sarah having gained another 2 ounces. She good baby, the housekeeper reported. Sleep through night, eat well, no fussing. I tell you, she fighter. Margaret gathered her daughter into her arms, breathed in that sweet baby smell, felt Sarah's tiny hand curl against her collarbone. The night away had been necessary, but nothing felt quite right without this small person nearby. Did you miss us? She murmured to Sarah. We missed you terribly. The baby made a soft cooing sound that Margaret chose to interpret as agreement. Spring arrived gradually, winter's grip loosening one day at a time. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would green up once the temperatures rose. The cattle moved to higher pastures, and Sarah grew, gaining weight and strength until Dr. Brennan declared her completely healthy and stopped his regular visits. She's caught up developmentally, he announced during his final examination in late April. You'd never know she was premature by looking at her now. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. By May, Sarah was 3 months old and nearly 12 pounds, still small for her age but thriving. She smiled readily now, tracking movement with bright eyes, making sounds that were almost but not quite words. She'd developed a thick head of dark hair and Dalton's stubborn chin, a combination that James claimed meant they were all doomed once she learned to talk. Margaret had taken on consulting work for 4 different ranches, balancing bookkeeping with childcare and household management. It was exhausting, but satisfying, proving to herself and others that she was more than just the scandal who'd trapped Dalton Reeves. On a warm afternoon in late May, a wagon rolled up to the ranch house. Margaret, playing with Sarah on a blanket in the yard, looked up to see Sarah Jensen climbing down, her 3 children tumbling out behind her. Mrs. Reeves, Sarah Jensen called out, somewhat formal. I hope we're not intruding. Not at all. Margaret stood, lifted baby Sarah into her arms. Please, come in. Mrs. Chen just made lemonade. They settled on the front porch, children running in the yard under the watchful eye of the oldest Jensen girl. Sarah Jensen accepted a glass of lemonade and took a long drink before speaking. I owe you an apology, she said abruptly. When this all started, When the town was gossiping about you, I didn't speak up. I didn't defend you, even though I knew what it felt like to be judged. Margaret remembered hearing that Sarah Jensen had been a widow herself before remarrying. You had your own reputation to protect. I understand. That's no excuse. I should have been braver. Sarah Jensen looked down at her hands. The truth is, seeing you face down that town council, seeing you refuse to be ashamed, it made me realize how much of my own life I've lived trying to please people who don't matter. You showed me a different way. I was terrified that whole time. But you did it anyway. That's what courage looks like. Sarah Jensen glanced at baby Sarah, who was gnawing contentedly on her own fist. She's beautiful, by the way. Perfect. Thank you, though I might be biased. They talked for over an hour, conversation flowing easily once the initial awkwardness passed. Sarah Jensen shared the challenges of raising 3 children largely alone, while her new husband worked long hours as a blacksmith. Margaret found herself offering advice about managing household accounts, ways to stretch a budget without sacrificing quality. When the Jensen family finally left, Sarah calling promises to visit again soon, Margaret felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Red Hollow had done real damage with its judgment, but it was progress, a bridge being built where only burned ground had existed before. June brought the ranch's busiest season. Cattle needed to be moved, fences repaired, hay cut and stored for winter. Dalton worked from dawn to dusk, coming home exhausted but satisfied. James had taken over most of the day-to-day operations, proving himself more than capable, which freed Dalton to spend evenings with his wife and daughter. Those evenings became Margaret's favorite time. After Sarah was put to bed, she and Dalton would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they discussed ranch business or Margaret's consulting work. Other times they simply existed together in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked one evening. "Standing up for me that day? Everything that came after?" Dalton was quiet for a moment, considering seriously. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that people we'd known for years turned cruel and judgmental. I regret that you had to endure any of that pain." He took her hand, threaded their fingers together. "But do I regret claiming you and Sarah publicly? Do I regret marrying you, building this life together? Not for a single second. Even though Morrison still spreads rumors? Even though Constance Fletcher crosses the street to avoid us when we're in town? Especially because of that. Those people's opinions aren't worth the air it takes to voice them. What matters is here. This ranch, this family, this life we're building. Everything else is noise." In July, word came that Constance Fletcher had been caught embezzling from the church funds. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The town's most vocal moralist exposed as a thief. She was quietly asked to leave Red Hollow, and the general sentiment seemed to be good riddance. "Karma," Mrs. Chen declared with satisfaction when the news reached the ranch. "Universe has balance. Bad people get what they deserve." Margaret wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly she just felt tired. So much energy had been wasted on judgment and cruelty when it could have been directed toward building community. But at least it was over now. At least the woman who'd led the charge against her was gone. By August, Sarah was 6 months old and sitting up on her own, grabbing at everything within reach with determined little hands. She'd developed a laugh that was pure joy, a sound that could make even the grimmest day feel manageable. Margaret was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Chen with preserves when Dalton came in with an odd expression. "There's someone here to see you," he said. "Both of you, actually." "Who?" "Mayor Blackwood and a delegation from town." Margaret's stomach clenched. She hadn't been back to Red Hollow since before Sarah's birth, had no desire to face the people who judged her so harshly. "What do they want?" "Says they'd like to talk. I can send them away if you'd rather." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, squared her shoulders. "No. Let's hear what they have to say." The delegation consisted of Mayor Blackwood, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton, the schoolteacher, Mr. Parsons from the church, and surprisingly, Douglas Cartwright from the cattlemen's gathering. They stood in the parlor looking uncomfortable, hats in hands, clearly uncertain of their welcome. "Mrs. Reeves, Mr. Reeves." The mayor cleared his throat. "Thank you for seeing us." "Say your piece," Dalton said, his tone not encouraging. Mayor Blackwood glanced at his companions, then seemed to steel himself. We've come to apologize for the way Red Hollow treated Mrs. Reeves, treated both of you, for the judgment, the cruelty, the assumptions we made without knowing the full truth. Margaret said nothing, waiting. Mrs. Thornton stepped forward. I was particularly cruel during that council meeting. I hid behind propriety and moral concerns when really I was just scared. Scared of change, of things I didn't understand. But that's no excuse for how we treated you. The town has suffered since you left, Douglas Cartwright added. We lost a skilled seamstress, an honest bookkeeper, and the respect of one of our most important citizens. That was foolish on our part. Mr. Parsons, who'd been one of the harshest critics, looked genuinely ashamed. I claimed to speak for righteousness, but I forgot the most basic tenet of my faith: compassion, forgiveness, the recognition that we all fall short in different ways. I'm sorry, Mrs. Reeves. Truly sorry. Margaret looked at each of them, seeing varying degrees of genuine contrition. Finally, she spoke. I appreciate you coming here. I appreciate the apology. But you need to understand what you did. You took a woman who was already terrified and vulnerable and made her feel like a criminal for the crime of existing. You threatened exile. You demanded public humiliation. And you did it all while claiming moral superiority. Her voice was steady but firm. I can forgive that, eventually. But I won't forget it, and I won't pretend it didn't leave scars. We understand, Mayor Blackwood said quietly. We're not asking for everything to go back to how it was. We're just asking for a chance to do better, to welcome you back to Red Hollow as the valued members of our community you should have been all along. There's going to be a town picnic next month, Mrs. Thornton added. We'd be honored if you'd attend, both of you and your daughter. Let people see what we see now, a family that deserves respect and celebration. Margaret looked at Dalton, who gave the smallest shrug. Your choice, his expression said. We'll think about it, Margaret said finally. That's all I can promise right now. The delegation accepted this with nods and thanks, then departed with considerably more dignity than they'd likely expected. After they left, Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. Are you all right? Dalton asked. I don't know. Part of me wants to tell them all to go to hell, but another part... She trailed off, struggling to articulate what she was feeling. Another part wants to believe people can change, that communities can heal, that maybe, just maybe, we could go back to Red Hollow without feeling like we're walking into enemy territory. We don't have to decide now. Think on it, see how you feel in a few weeks. Sarah's cry echoed from upstairs, the demanding wail of a baby who'd woken from her nap and wanted immediate attention. Margaret went to her daughter, lifted her from the cradle, felt tiny arms wrap around her neck in what might have been a hug but was probably just grabbing. What do you think? She murmured to Sarah. Should we give Red Hollow another chance? Sarah grabbed a handful of Margaret's hair and yanked, which Margaret chose to interpret as encouragement. The town picnic arrived on a perfect September day, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of early autumn. Margaret dressed Sarah in a white dress that Mrs. Chen had embroidered with tiny flowers, and wore her own best day dress, a soft blue that Dalton said brought out her eyes. They drove into Red Hollow as a family, Sarah on Margaret's lap, Dalton handling the reins with easy confidence. Margaret's heart pounded as the town came into view, but she kept her expression serene. The picnic was held in the town square, tables laden with food, children running between the trees, adults clustered in conversation. Heads turned when the Reeves wagon arrived, but this time the stares felt different. Curious rather than hostile. Interested rather than judgmental. Sarah Jensen was the first to approach, her children trailing behind her. You came. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I, Margaret admitted, but we thought we'd give it a try. More people filtered over, some to apologize, others simply to meet Sarah and coo over her chubby cheeks and bright eyes. The baby was her usual charming self, smiling at everyone, making sounds that people interpreted as conversation. Not everyone was welcoming. There were still those who turned away, who whispered behind hands, who couldn't get past their judgment. But they were the minority now, and their disapproval seemed to matter less than it once had. Halfway through the afternoon, Margaret found herself sitting at a picnic table with a group of women she'd once considered acquaintances. They talked about children, about the challenges of the coming winter, about the new reverend who'd replaced the previous one. Normal conversation, the kind Margaret had thought she'd never have again in this town. "I was wrong about you," one woman, Martha from the general store, said quietly. "We all were. You're stronger than any of us gave you credit for." "I'm just a woman trying to live her life with some dignity," Margaret replied. "Same as everyone else." "But you did it against impossible odds. That takes courage." Margaret looked across the square to where Dalton stood with James and a cluster of other ranchers, Sarah held securely in his arms. As if sensing her attention, he looked up, caught her eye, smiled. "It wasn't courage," Margaret said softly. "It was love. Love strong enough to weather judgment, that's all." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret stood with her family, Dalton on one side, James on the other, Sarah cradled between them. They watched the town they'd once fled now slowly, tentatively welcoming them back. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. The scars would always be there, but it was progress. It was healing. It was the possibility of belonging. "Ready to go home?" Dalton asked quietly. Margaret looked around one last time, at the people who'd judged her and the ones who'd defended her, at the town that had been both cruel and kind, at the life she'd rebuilt from ashes. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." The ranch welcomed them back as it always did, solid and enduring against the darkening sky. Mrs. Chen had left a fire burning in the hearth, had prepared a simple dinner that waited on the stove. It was peaceful in a way Red Hollow could never be, this space they'd claimed as theirs. That night, after Sarah was asleep in her cradle, after the house had settled into quiet, Margaret stood at the bedroom window looking out at the stars. Dalton came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, pulled her back against his chest. "Any regrets?" he asked. Margaret thought about everything that had led them here. The blizzard, the pregnancy, the scandal, the pain, the survival. She thought about the impossible baby sleeping peacefully in the next room, about the man who'd stood beside her when he could have walked away, about the life they'd built from pieces everyone said wouldn't fit together. "Not a single one," she said, and meant it. Because this was the truth that Red Hollow had finally learned, the truth that would outlast every whispered rumor and every judgment. Love didn't bow to scandal, courage didn't belong exclusively to the young, and some truths, the important ones, the ones that mattered, stood taller than any lie that tried to bury them. Margaret Reeves had been called shameful, impossible, scandalous. She'd been judged by her age, by her circumstances, by a town that thought it knew better than biology what was possible. But she'd also been called wife, mother, survivor. She'd been claimed publicly by a man powerful enough to silence his critics. She'd built a family from nothing, had found love when she'd stopped believing in it. And in the end, standing in the home she'd earned through sheer force of will, with her daughter sleeping nearby and her husband's arms around her, Margaret understood something fundamental. The town's approval had never been the prize. This was. This life. This love. This impossible, improbable, precious family. Everything else was just noise. And noise, as Dalton had once told her, was easy to ignore when you knew what truly mattered. Sarah stirred in her sleep, made a soft sound. Margaret moved to the cradle, looked down at her daughter, this child who'd changed everything, who'd been worth every moment of pain and judgment and fear. "You're going to grow up knowing you're wanted," Margaret whispered. "You're going to grow up strong and brave and completely certain that you belong. That's my promise to you." Dalton appeared beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Together they stood watch over their sleeping daughter, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of scandal. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, 3 hearts beat in the peaceful rhythm of belonging. And in Red Hollow, slowly but surely, people were learning what Margaret and Dalton had known all along. Love that refuses to bow to judgment will always, always prevail.